Chapter 829. Whoosh, poking his head out of a large eroded hole on the seabed, Keyes chewed and swallowed the deep-sea behemoth that he had just pulled out with satisfaction. Like the krakens that he had devoured before, this was also a huge sea monster that tasted very delicious. In order to hunt down such a legendary creature, Keyes had been diving in the depths of the ocean for half an hourglass. Along the way, he could only rely on attacking time and time again, plucking the huge chelicerae from the body of this sea monster that looked like a mixture of a lobster and a whale to replenish his strength. However, hard work would eventually pay off. After eating several appetizers, the deep-sea behemoth had an extremely strong regenerative ability. Keyes finally had a decent meal and finally filled his stomach that had been rumbling since he woke up. Burp! The megalosaurus burped with satisfaction. Blazing heat spewed out from its throat, and a water column that was dozens of feet high suddenly rose from the sea more than 1,000 yards away. Now that I've finished breakfast, it's time to settle those matters. In fact, when Keyes had just woken up and his consciousness had yet to return, the steampunk Demolic had already detected the huge energy fluctuations caused by his use of the teleportation spell. While he was eating breakfast, Snade had used an enhanced communication spell to communicate with him, conveying the current situation in King's Landing City to this young dragon who had just woken up, although it was a little untrue. Therefore, since he had already filled his stomach, Keyes did not want to waste any more time and directly rushed to the surface of the sea. Before using the advanced teleportation spell again, not only did he have to carefully calibrate the coordinates of the destination, but he also had to dry off the water on his body. Otherwise, with his current body that was comparable to the size of an island, he would crush the fragile city at the same time as he appeared, or bring a large amount of salt into the city, bringing a crisis to the city's industrial and agricultural production. Should I transform into a human and use the advanced teleportation spell again? This idea flashed through Keyes's mind. However, after growing into a young dragon, for some unknown reason, he seemed to be somewhat resistant to the idea of transforming into a humanoid creature. He vaguely felt that if he continued to transform into his human form as frequently as before, it might have an adverse effect on his future. Let's measure the coordinates again. Keyes, who had always followed his heart, decided to return to King's Landing in his megalosaurus form. Because of this, he had to be careful. However, it was not easy to locate the coordinates in the vast sea. The young blue dragon swam for a while. There were only fong-like rocks between the waves, but there was nothing special. Then, he saw a huge iron tower standing in the sea. A flame mixed with oil flickered at the top of the tower. It was a platform suspended above the sea. It was more than 200 square feet in area, and its weight was supported by 3 thick metal supports. The waves slapped against the brackets, making loud banging sounds. On the platform, there were clusters of seemingly messy spires, and the crane was like a moving claw. At the top of the platform was a huge iron tower made of overhead beams. Occasionally, flames would drip from the top, and the ripples caused by the magic energy distorted the space above the flames. In the shadow below the platform, a metal pipe was inserted into the sea. The internal structure of the platform flashed with light. A few armored patrol ships circled around the platform. Their decks were sometimes bright and sometimes dark, and they communicated with each other with light signals from time to time. There is no doubt that this should be an offshore drilling platform. Keyes, who was lurking in the water, thought quickly. But the question is, why is there such a platform in this sea? Who is mining the black oil resources under the seabed here? He observed for a moment from a distance away from the platform, but he did not see any creatures coming out from the platform or the armored ships. With doubts in his mind, Quest circled around for a while. In the end, he found another platform with flames on top of it 30 kilometers away from the platform. It was bigger than the previous one. It stood on 4 weather-beaten concrete pillars. The platform structure was more sparse, and there was a short and thick tower at each corner. There was also a large crane operating at the edge. On this fixed platform, Keys finally found the creature operating the platform. Shouldn't the gnomes stay on Gnome Island? When did they start building permanent and semi-permanent offshore platforms so far away from Gnome Island? The young blue dragon fell into deep thought. A gust of wind blew on the sea, and the weather was as cold as iron. He circled around hundreds of pale sand, and together with the two he had found before, he found a total of 5 offshore platforms. 4 of them were semi-permanent and seemed to be able to be towed by barges. One was a permanent building with a large number of berths under the platform for large ships to rest. Not only that, Keys also figured out the approximate location of this place. Still benefiting from the books he had read before, he distinguished from the chain of small islands scattered in this sea area that were shaped like sawtooth that should be a place named Fin Islands by the Emperor. King's Landing City was at least 2,000 pale sand to the south, and Gnome Island was about 1,000 pale sand to the west. The Fin Islands were a completely barren land in the Ramsey Plain. When the Emperor toured the plain, he had already explored this place and found that there were no intelligent creatures living on the islands. There were basically no signs of magical creatures. The vegetation on the islands was mostly cold-resistant and salt-resistant shrubs, and there was a lack of wood that could support beams and houses. In short, this island was very barren, so the Emperor named it Fin, which was similar to chicken ribs. But now, Keys found traces of gnomes here, which made him hesitate. I have to use magic to solve this problem. The young blue dragon's nostrils flared, and a surge of heat surged out. A large amount of mist rose from the sea. However, the mist did not dissipate with the wind, but was pulled into a thin mist line under the effect of magic. One end was connected to the Megalosaurus, which was the origin, and the other end was pointed to a distance that could explain Keys's doubts. Keys's speed could no longer be accurately described as an arrow released from a bow. Driven by curiosity, he moved underwater at a speed comparable to an intercontinental missile. If he did not remember to use magic to eliminate the movement he caused in the process of moving, there would have been a huge tsunami in the sea. After a while, Keys crossed the chain of islands of Fin Islands and saw an underwater mountain named Sundial Rock by the Emperor. The top of this mountain protruded out of the sea like a probe. Under the sunlight, this natural sundial would cast a long and narrow shadow shaped like a pointer on the lush mangrove dial at its base. Chapter 830. On the horizon far away from Sundial Rock, Keys saw a city standing in the middle of the sea. It was located between clumps of cold-resistant cold-water corals, built of concrete, steel, rock, and glass. Many pillars were surrounded by spiral-shaped walkways and connected by bridges as thin as silk. At the top of the dark castle stood a complex conical spire, up to 100 feet high. The entire building complex was filled with incompatible styles. The messy silhouettes against the sky were like exaggerated coral reefs in children's graffiti. The protruding towers seemed to be alive, and their shape was similar to clusters of tube worms. Some of the high-rise residential buildings imitated the shape of lace corals, with long and narrow houses distributed among the branches, and the low ring-shaped buildings with many windows were like giant cylindrical sponges. Some other buildings showed a corrugated structure of flaming coral. In the underwater city, row upon row of tall towers stood above the waves. The doorways that were at sea level were like big mouth. Green floating algae residue marked the height of the tide line, and when the tide rose, these doorways would be submerged. There were also newer buildings here. The oval-shaped buildings cut out of rock were inlaid with iron bars on the surface, and the underwater roof protruded from the protruding supports, holding them up. Rows of short brick houses were built on the floating platforms, which looked out of place in the sea. From above sea level to the distant high places, the walkways and bridges were filled with thousands of midgets, and a certain number of other creatures were mixed in. dozens of flat-bottomed cruises and small boats leisurely traveled between the towers. The ships that were ready to go out to sea were anchored outside the city, tied to the pillars in the sea. They were all fishing boats, sampans, and sailboats. Occasionally, there were a few steamships, and the ironclads that Keyes had seen near the offshore drilling platform. Another midget city, Keyes thought to himself. Who built this city? Following his thought, the young blue dragon suddenly appeared on the street above the sea. He had to transform into a midget. When he came closer, he could feel what the other creatures he had just seen were. It turned out that they were also midget. However, the appearance of these pygmies was different from ordinary pygmies. They were taller than ordinary pygmies, close to half the height of a normal human. Their upper bodies had small gills on their necks. Living underwater for a long time had caused their skin to be much paler than ordinary pygmies. Below their waist, in addition to 2 legs, they also had a tail covered in hard armor. Their large and rough shell and interlocking body segments were like giant lobsters. The lobster's eyes and tentacles were replaced by the dwarf's abdomen. Even in the relatively unfamiliar air, the appendages under the numerous tails were similarly complex and nimble. When they walked, they would make a slight knocking sound. These lobster pygmies, or aquatic pygmies, usually wore clothes woven from some kind of tough seaweed fiber. They also liked to decorate their hard-shelled tails with tattoos, carving patterns there, and coloring them with various kinds of extract. On the side of the hard-shelled tails of some of the older aquatic pygmies, Keyes could see through invisibility. He also discovered some special rune arrays drawn with invisibility paint. Cold resistance increase, rigid skin, cat's elegance. Keyes recognized the effects of many of the rune arrays. He was surprised to discover that if he were to look at it in terms of percentage, the proportion of spellcasters, who were qualified to draw and activate the invisibility rune arrays, among the aquatic pygmies was much higher than that of ordinary pygmies. Moreover, compared to the illusion-type spells that the pygmies were originally good at, the talents of these aquatic pygmies seemed to be more inclined towards the defense type and the transformation type. After walking across a bridge, and seeing that there was no one around, Keyes immediately transformed into an aquatic pygmy. He jumped down from the stone stairs and quickly sank into the sea. Under the sea, there were many submersibles that were obviously in the style of the pygmies swimming continuously, like large metal fish. The anchors and chains hanging down from the sea formed some areas that were difficult to pass through. If they wanted to pass through, they could only go around or move as slowly as possible. It was a stark contrast to the agile aquatic pygmies. There were floating lights everywhere. The cold moon-like light balls were completely different from the orange-red color of the gas lamps on the streets of Pygmy Island at night in Keyes' memory. The entire underwater city flickered in the dark water, like a rope net that was hung with will-o'-the-wisp. Moreover, unlike the cities on land, this underwater city was more like a three-dimensional city. Its periphery was a cluster of low buildings, distributed among the porous rocks and corals. The whole city had more than a dozen spoke-like main roads that gradually climbed from the periphery of the city to the center of the city. The top of some of the buildings were either faintly visible above the water surface, or they were directly exposed above the sea surface. However, the other buildings that were not in the center of the city were not only tall, some of them were even built directly along the bottom of the sea. In short, this was a city that was intertwined and extended in all directions. Although this underwater city seemed to be silent from the surface of the sea, it was actually very lively. There were aquatic pygmies everywhere in the city. Every few blocks there was a special commercial street. Colorful cloth was hanging in front of the shops, and aquatic pygmies were speaking a variant of the pygmy language and bargaining passionately. Small squares were planted with neatly trimmed kelp, and aquatic pygmy farmers were arguing about which crop should be planted at this time of the year. The streets and alleys were crisscrossed, and there were caravans full of goods, the aquatic pygmy coachman manipulated huge crab-like beasts that were more than 8 feet tall to carry large amounts of goods. Children playing in their own coral yards would occasionally use sticks to tease the lanternfish that were locked in the fences. After spending a while, Keyes roughly browsed the layout of the entire city, and then he found his target. It was a complex building located in the center of the city. Its spherical surface was covered with wrinkles, and it looked like an unbelievably large brain coral. Surrounding this building, there were many towers that pierced the water surface and into the air. The outer walls of these towers were decorated with hieroglyphics and phonetic characters, the characters used by the pygmies in different periods of time. The open windows and doorways allowed small fish to enter and exit unhindered. However, the spherical building, which was the main building, was sealed. It was equipped with a large number of small round windows made of crystal and thick metal doors. A string of bubbles continuously emerged from the air vent, rising to the sea surface. This was the Pygmy Temple. Chapter 831. That was the Temple of Gar Glittergold. The god of dwarfs, Gar Glittergold, looked like a handsome dwarf with golden skin and eyes that shone like gemstones. He usually liked to wear gorgeous clothes and accessories. In the temple of Ramses Dwarf Island, the statue of the dwarf god wore a silk tuxedo and a pair of silk stockings. Unlike the image of a master of mischief that many people were familiar with, in the eyes of the dwarfs, this god of dwarfs was actually more like a vigilant protector. Ever since the dwarfs left the kingdom of fairies, this kind god began to take care of them, extraditing them to various planes of the multiverse to reproduce and spread their branches and leaves. Under his careful care, the dwarfs, who were slightly weak but occasionally caused some trouble, were able to establish themselves in many worlds. And because of this, Gar Glittergold was loved and respected by most dwarfs. As a successful god of dwarfs, he had already reached the peak of the great divine power a long time ago. In the recent tens of thousands of years, due to the experience brought by the passage of time, Gar Glittergold had become less directly involved in the lives of the dwarfs. However, as long as the dwarfs had problems that were difficult to solve, he was still happy to respond to his believers. Even if some of the problems involved conflicts with certain gods, although Gar Glittergold didn't like this, his power was undeniable. When necessary, the dwarf god would also pick up his netherworld dancing battle axe called Aram Dinar and fearlessly resolve those disputes. To be fair, Keyes definitely didn't want to be enemies with Gar Glittergold. So, even if he encountered the obstacle of Dwarf Island when developing his power, he didn't have the intention to destroy the Ramsey dwarfs. Keyes didn't want to use his own skull to test the sharpness of a great divine power's weapon. From the beginning to the end, he only wanted to deal with the dwarf, the god of virtual games. Keyes passed through a spacious and dark doorway and entered the interior of a side building. The aquatic dwarf priest below waved his arms and guided him to the end of the enclosed concrete corridor. A huge door slammed shut behind him. Huge bubbles suddenly gushed out of the thick pipes lining the wall. The seawater was forced out through valves and floodgates. The water level slowly lowered. His legs gradually landed on the concrete floor, and the water level dropped below the parotid gland. The water droplets flowed down Keyes's body, leaving traces on the ground. The aquatic midget priest who had guided him earlier also walked in. He opened a tight valve, and a pleasant breeze blew in, carrying the scent of cinnamon and apples. It seemed to be used to cover the smell of seaweed and fish that existed in the temple. Behind the priest stood a female aquatic dwarf. She seemed to be a warrior and held a spear in her hand. However, it was too delicate. Keyes guessed that it might be a ceremonial tool and not a weapon. The priests and warriors wore bright green breastplates on their upper bodies. They were not made of metal, but more like polymer. In the middle of the breastplates, there was a faint, glowing golden pattern. "I didn't mean to offend you," Keyes calmed his mind and tried to speak the words that matched the aquatic dwarf's sentence pattern, pronunciation, and grammar with the help of the glib tongue and the vocabulary he had heard during his tour of the underwater city. The two aquatic dwarves understood his words and began to talk with him. Their language was clattering, and the short vibrato could be transmitted in the air and water. "Your visit has been known to our Lord," the priest carefully corrected Keys's tense. "Please move into the temple and listen to the teachings of the great god." The young blue dragon, who had transformed into an aquatic dwarf, nodded in agreement. He followed the two priests and walked along a wide corridor into the main building of the temple that looked like brain coral. When he walked in, he found that the arc-shaped dome of the temple had been cast with a divine spell. It was as if it was made of completely transparent glass, and he could see the situation outside without any hindrance. A circle of huge aquatic plant petri dishes surrounded the edge of the building. A large number of gorgeous marine plants grew inside, like a huge flower garden. Some parts of the walls were covered with brocade, showing the various stories of how the city rose from the depths of the ocean. The ground was covered with white slabs, which were quite dry, and looked warm under the effect of magic. Stepping on them, one would not feel the chill under the sea at all. After leading Keys into the temple, the two aquatic dwarves took their leave. The great dwarf god wanted to meet guests, and they were not qualified to stay here. When they left, a water curtain suddenly rose from the door, and the original door disappeared in an instant. The temple seemed to be integrated, standing alone in the depths of the ocean. "Do you like liquor or cocktails?" A playful voice suddenly sounded. Keys looked at the center of the temple, and a handsome dwarf with golden light suddenly appeared. He held two small wine glasses in his hands. When he saw Keys looking at him, the dwarf smiled and greeted him. "I guess it's the latter, so please, Mr. Keys." Keys had just entered the stage of youth, and he was invited to drink. It was completely in line with Gar Dazzlingly's clever and mischievous temperament. He could not refuse. He could only reach out his hand, and a cup that was originally in the hands of the gods suddenly appeared in Keys's palm. There was a pool of light green liquor in the cup, and there was a faint smell of grass floating out. "Let us drink this cup and wish you a long life, ha ha ha." Gar Dazzlingly took the lead to drink up the wine in the cup. When he saw Keys do the same, he immediately revealed a smile, as if he had succeeded in his scheme. "In order to entertain guests, I specially got the secret cocktail recipe of a certain ogre gourmet, and I also found the most important seasoning in it. It was provided by his brother, and it has the effect of improving energy. You named it the 6 gods yourself. The taste of this cup of wine is very authentic, isn't it?" Gar dazzlingly winked at Keys. If it were not for the fact that he might not be able to defeat him, Keys, who was very intoxicated after drinking the special cocktail, would probably have rushed over to give this mischievous god an unforgettable lesson. However, he could only endure it for now. In the future, Keys secretly cursed in his heart, but he still had a smile on his face and said flattering words. "Of course, your cooking is very authentic. However, I'm curious, why did you let someone guide me to this meeting?" Chapter 832. After a short meeting, the hospitable, gnome master god, Gar Dazzlinggold, gave Keys a breakfast that he would never forget. After that, the young blue dragon walked out of the temple that was shaped like a brain coral. He directly transformed into the form of a megalosaurus and emerged from the water. He spread his wings and flew towards King's Landing City. After Keys left, Gar Dazzlinggold immediately summoned his chief aquatic gnome priest and solemnly instructed him, "From today onwards, we must add a few more dishes to the secret dishes of the underwater city. We can't let that megalosaurus know that today's dishes were all made up by me, ha ha ha." Perhaps some people would think that Keys was in a bad mood. After all, before he flew out of the sea, he had, accidentally, swung his tail when he transformed into the form of a megalosaurus, causing all the towers of Gar Dazzlinggold's temple to collapse. However, the young blue dragon was actually in a good mood. Although his tongue had suffered a little, his stomach definitely wouldn't. He had gotten a promise in exchange for this meal. The powerful gnome master god made it clear that he would not take any hostile measures against Keys just because he wanted to target Stim. He would also restrict all gnome gods except Stim from interfering in this matter. According to what he said, the domain of divinity that Stim had chosen had already shown a terrifying characteristic that could destroy the curiosity and creativity of the gnomes. It was precisely because of this that Gar Dazzling Gold would build such a shelter-like city in the Coldclaw Sea north of the Sundial Rock. The first inhabitants of this place were all transported here from Gnome Island through secret channels. These people didn't have a good life on Gnome Island. They were neither happy nor comfortable. Among them were some gnome scholars who had been persecuted by Stim's priest because of their research on the theory of the dangers of addiction to virtual games. That was why Gar Dazzling Gold had rescued them one after another. The gnome master god had always insisted on this sheltered city plan. Starting from the day that the god of virtual games, Stim, ascended to the divine throne, he had kept the gnomes of this sheltered city in check for 300 years. In the history of Pygmy Island, these pygmies were the sum of all the traveling population and missing population in the past 300 years. In order to let the dwarfs live a better life in the city of shelter, Gaul dazzlingly spent a lot of divine power to create a subspecies of dwarfs called aquatic dwarfs. Almost 2 whole generations of curious dwarves had volunteered to join the Lord God's transformation plan. In Shelter City, the 3rd generation of aquatic midgets were all the offspring of their mothers. They worked together with some dwarves who were unwilling to change their appearance or who had just been transported to the city to build the city of Shelter. Using the black oil collected from the deep sea, they continued to develop the dwarven industry, building a composite city that combined the intelligence of both the sea and the surface. Why don't you let this city appear in Ramsey? The industrial level here is even more advanced than that of King's Landing City. The scale of perpetual order can provide more development and more opportunities for such an industrial city. This was Keys's last question to Gaul dazzlingly. The gnome master god's answer was, "Perhaps I have completed the ecosystem of the aquatic midgets, and they can survive as a species in Ramsey. This sheltered city can provide them and other midgets with a chance to survive one day. But the social system of the aquatic midgets has not been completed yet. When Stim intends to rise, I cannot predict whether his infectious divine domain will once again invade this sheltered city." The young blue dragon immediately gave his own assurance. "He won't have that chance." When he finished this sentence, a large number of golden runes appeared out of thin air in the underwater temple. Keys and Gaul dazzlingly had reached an agreement. With this agreement in hand, Keys returned to King's Landing City with a peace of mind. It was actually not shameful to be a fighter for a god with great divine power. After completing the age-level transformation, Keys had been swimming in the sea to hunt for prey. This was the first time he had flown into the sky again. However, he did not enjoy this activity for too long. After repeated calculations, the young blue dragon finally confirmed the exact coordinates of the target location and then used the greater transmission spell. The distance of thousands of pale sand was crossed. When he reappeared, Keys was already high in the sky above King's Landing City. He spread his wings like a large dark cloud, casting a shadow that covered the huge city in an instant. At this time, dawn had just passed. Except for certain groups of people, the people who lived and worked in King's Landing City had actually just woken up from their sleep. At the same time, the steampunk half-lich, who had been carefully monitoring the waves of magic, immediately discovered the huge creature that had been transmitted above their heads. Sneyd immediately used a spell to send a message to the young blue dragon about the assault that had lasted from last night to this morning. Keys cast his gaze down from the vault of heaven, overlooking this city that belonged to the scale of perpetual order. He saw the maze that Sneyd had mentioned. In his magical vision, a bright light of magic was hovering above a street in King's Landing City. A transparent protective cover formed completely by magic covered that street like a giant bowl that had been turned upside down. After a while, there would be a strong flash of light in this maze, which meant that someone was trying to unlock it. In the center of the street covered by the maze stood a building that looked like a bastion. Smooth stone walls that were dozens of feet high formed the walls of this building. Some towers were located in each corner of the bastion, and at the top of each tower were several camel people or polar bear people, elemental shamans, who were constantly throwing fireballs, lightning, and deadly poisonous smoke down below. A large number of monsters that had once wreaked havoc on this land were once again reborn in this maze, like bamboo shoots after a spring rain. They constantly attacked the bastion without fear of death, and it seemed that after each death, the bodies of the monsters would be collected and used again. However, with the support of the elemental shamans on the walls and sufficient defensive machinery, the bastion still withstood the attacks of the monsters that surged like a tide. However, other than that small bastion, there were no other buildings that were higher than the ground in this street. According to the information that Snade had sent, there should have been more than 2,000 criminals from the Yayoi family in this commercial street, but at this time, there was no trace of them. Only a large number of monsters were left. Chapter 833. This place should have been destroyed 10,000 times over, Stim cursed viciously. Because of his extreme rage, the face of the lightning monk that bore his divine power was contorted. I will spread salt all over the ruins of this city. That is if you can escape from here, the emperor who stood beside him said emotionlessly. When he spoke, it was as if there was a council arguing inside his hood. So, great God, please think about what you should do now. Stim glared at the emperor, but he was not stupid enough to retort. They were now grasshoppers on the same rope. Moreover, because of the large number of spirit extinguishers that the Demolic had unleashed in the magic lock, there were many obstacles for him to use his divine spells. Even if he used his full strength, he could only display 50 to 60% of his usual effect. That was why the god of virtual games needed the Emperor's help. The magic lock is a large-scale magical barrier that was invented by the god of magic of the elves, Corellon. The reason why it is not widely used, aside from the staggering cost of setting up a magic lock, is more because of its loopholes. No matter what form of magic lock it is, its largest area of influence would not exceed the four-dimensional space. In other words, the magical energy that forms it must have a node or hub. As long as we find this loophole, we can stop the magical energy of the magic lock from working. In terms of magical attainment, even if Stim was a god, the Emperor's knowledge still far exceeded his. Therefore, it was the Emperor who commanded Stim when it came to deciphering the magic lock. We have tried hundreds of times. We have searched every place in this space that could hide the hub of the magic lock more than once. Only that fortress, because we have been creating an army of monsters to attack, we have neglected to explore it. I am 90% sure that the hub of the magic lock we are looking for should be hidden in that temporary fortress. After hearing the Emperor's analysis, Stim could not help but frown. But what should we do? Should we just teleport into the fortress and look for the possible hub of the magic lock? Then, we would have to spend some effort to decipher it. There is an army stationed there, and those who are involved in the defense of the fortress are all combat elites of powerful races. This god's incarnation had its own concerns. Rushing into the fortress, finding the core of the magic lock, and breaking the spell, each of these 3 steps was not particularly difficult for them, but it was a big problem to do all 3 steps at the same time. After entering the fortress, Stim was of no help at all in finding the magic lock and breaking the spell. He could only rely on the Emperor to complete it alone. After an entire night of trying to break through, they already understood how heaven-defying the strength of this magic lock was. In other words, even for an Emperor, it would take some effort to find the core of the labyrinth or unlock its spell. During that process, the defenders in the fortress would definitely not wait for them to unlock it, and the heavy responsibility of resisting the army's attack would fall entirely on Stim's shoulders. Due to the soul-extinguishing essence that the steampunk Demolic had fused into the lock, Stim couldn't fully utilize his divine power. Although gods were basically unable to be killed by mortals, in the history of the multiverse, there had been many major incidents where mortals had killed the incarnations of gods. Unfortunately, in these major events, the main characters who slaughtered the incarnations of gods were often the elite troupe. Stim had no intention of using this incarnation of his to test the strength of King's Landing's army. Seeing the hesitation on the face of the god of virtual games incarnation, the Emperor moved closer to him and whispered, "This is the only way, but I can understand your concerns. As an ally, I have a suggestion from the bottom of my heart." With that, without waiting for Stim to react, the Emperor grasped the hands of the Lightning Monk incarnation. Surging power roared out of his body, instantly pouring into the incarnation of the god of virtual games. "What have you done?" Stim cried out in surprise. "To make you stronger and break through the shackles of a mortal incarnation so that you can deal with the upcoming mission," the Emperor replied. In the blink of an eye, Stim's incarnation of the Lightning Monk rapidly expanded like a balloon. His clothes were torn apart by his bulging muscles, and Ramsey's human appearance was rapidly deformed. His skin began to thicken and harden, and even marble-like veins appeared. His mouth opened like a tautye's, and razor-like fangs turned out from his lips. 2 meatballs bulged out from his shoulder blades, and soon, 2 arms broke out of the flesh and blood. Using the incarnation of a god as a base, the Emperor infused it with the soul cores of Chong Jiao and the Azura Ghost King, creating his 11th General of Calamity. Although this general would definitely not be as obedient as the others, it should be enough to protect him as an ally for the time being. "It's time for us to move, great god." When the 10-foot-tall Calamity's body had completely taken shape, the Emperor immediately used a superior teleportation spell to appear outside the walls of the fortress guarded by the Polar Bearmen and Camel Warriors. Large numbers of monsters were attacking the fortress, which was why the defenders did not notice an inconspicuous figure appearing in a shadowy corner of the walls. The reason why they did not directly teleport into the fortress was that this fortress was built by the elemental shamans. When the spellcasters built the fortress, they cast a large number of spells on it, including some defensive spells such as Dimensional Anchor and Banishment spell. If the Emperor and the others rashly used the superior teleportation spell to break through the fortress, it was likely that they would be temporarily imprisoned or banished. That was why the Emperor had spent so much effort to transform more than 2,000 humans in the Yayoi family mansion into all kinds of monsters and ordered them to launch continuous feints against the fortress. Damn the scale of perpetual order. How much defense equipment and heavy weapons did they bring? "They're really rich and powerful," the Emperor said in his heart with hatred. 12 years ago, he had lost to such an organization with such a huge amount of resources. It was not easy for him to be resurrected, so he was absolutely furious when he saw his enemy. Fortunately, I was prepared. The characteristics of the 2 Calamity Generals, Shredding Bone and Incarnation, are combined. The powerful monster created will definitely be able to break this tortoise shell. The Emperor's lips moved, and he quickly recited a series of spells. The monsters that died outside the walls of the fortress were all recovered by the other monsters while they were desperately attacking the fortress. Now, when the Emperor began to cast spells, the monsters that had died in anger and pain all opened their eyes. Chapter 834. Burying a conscious undead creature in a non-sacred place. When the lingering decay of the undead creature seeped into the ground, it would cause the entire cemetery, corpses, tombstones, and everything else to gather into a greedy undead monster. This was the secret method to create a necropolis demon. The amazingly talented Emperor had already optimized it many years ago. He found that using the characteristics of shredding bone and incarnation could better enhance the effect of this spell, and even directly create a legendary monster. However, during his previous reign, using two intelligent Necropolis generals to exchange for a powerful legendary monster that could only act based on instinct was definitely not a smart approach, and the Emperor would certainly not try it. But now, he had to pay the price for his impulsiveness. If I had known that meeting with this *T incarnation might lead to the encirclement of the scale of perpetual order, I would never have met him. The Emperor cursed fiercely in his heart, but the gestures of his hands and the incantation of his mouth did not stop. He was carefully mobilizing the power of the spell, and using precise and subtle operations to change the spell to summon the Necropolis demon. A large number of corpses of monsters that had just been transformed and then died in battle gradually merged with the ground and rubble under them. All kinds of corpses were pieced together, reorganized, and connected in an unnatural way. Finally, they were shaped by the power of magic. The Emperor had created an active monster grave. It had a certain level of intelligence and was greedy for more corpses. The meaning of its existence was only to increase its size and ability by devouring more corpses. So, it got up from the ground and kept moving towards the battlefield. Although it preferred rotten corpses, it did not mind killing life itself and then throwing it into the filthy soil in its body that could quickly rot the corpses. Compared to the ordinary Necropolis demon, the monster created by the Emperor by combining the characteristics of two Necropolis generals was more like a Tana Re-Dretch magnified countless times. It had a round belly, two short and thick legs that were slightly pocket-sized compared to its huge body, two long arms like a gibbon were constantly waving forward, and the sharp claws seemed to want to grab something at every moment. But in fact, its huge body was composed of corpses, rubble, and soil. From a distance, the creature looked like a hulking giant made of mud and stone. However, upon closer inspection, one could distinguish the palms, heads, and other limbs protruding from the dead monster's body. What was even more terrifying was that these things seemed to be endowed with some sort of vitality by magic. Not only did it have a ferocious appearance, but it was also a genuine legendary monster. In particular, with the characteristics of two Calamity Generals, this undying monster's attacks became even more dangerous and fatal. Hellscream, which was set up on the walls of the bastion, aimed at the monster and fired a barrage of fiery cannonballs at it. The elemental shamans on the top of the towers around the bastion also summoned a lot of lightning bolts and explosive fireballs, hitting it with full force. However, after suffering these attacks, the monster continued to move forward as if nothing had happened. When the monster was less than 100 steps away from the bastion, it suddenly stepped forward, and its thick arms fell to the ground in an instant. The earth trembled violently, and the walls of the bastion, which were summoned by magic, were torn with many large and small holes in an instant. Its back shook at a high frequency, and clusters of arrow-like mixtures of corpses and rubble flew out, crossing the city wall and falling into the central square of the bastion. This was the avatar trick that Calamity Generals were best at. The mixtures that flew into the bastion might not cause much damage, but they soon stood up again and turned into small giants made of corpses and rubble. They immediately pounced on the surrounding polar bear men and camel warriors. If they were smashed into pieces, it would be fine, but if those warriors were killed, they would immediately be dragged into the monster's body and turned into nourishment. Roar, roar, roar. Feeling the growth of his avatar, the monster standing outside the bastion seemed to laugh heartily and let out a continuous roar. With his long roar, those avatars also twitched and trembled. Bone spurs protruded from the surface of his body and then shot out. In a split second, the bastion was filled with the sound of arrows falling like rain. The sharp bone spikes and arrows formed a curtain of death. Now, hiding in the shadows below the bastion walls, the Emperor spoke loudly to the avatar of the god, who had the figure of Chong Jiao and 4 arms like an Azura demon king. "Enter the bastion. I'll find the core of the lock and crack it, and you'll protect me." With that, the Emperor flashed into a fissure and slipped into the bastion. The avatar of the god of virtual games, who was about to transform into calamity, turned into a puff of smoke and hovered beside the Emperor. At the moment, the warriors stationed in the bastion were all caught up in the fierce battle against the tomb monsters, and had no time to care about anything else. Therefore, the Emperor and Stim's infiltration went very smoothly. After a while, they found the core of the lock. So they set up an alternate space to hide. Beside a pillar at the center of the bastion, the Emperor used his palm to place the floating puzzle of 9 palaces on the surface of the pillar. In an instant, light flashed and a door abruptly appeared. There should be a guard inside. Let's see who it is. The Emperor extended his hand, and the smoke around his arm entered the door first. Then, he followed her in. The avatar of the god of virtual games, who was about to transform into calamity, was now fighting a steel giant. The iconic huge ebony spikes, its cold luster, and the buzzing circular saw that extended from the mechanical construct reminded the Emperor of the storm mech he encountered 12 years ago. "You guys play for a while," the Emperor thought to himself as he restrained his desire for revenge. "Wait until I've unlocked the core of the lock." Just as he was plotting something, an indescribable sense of panic suddenly struck his heart. It was as if he had completely lost something precious, such as the traits of Avatar and Shredder. "The tomb is completely dead," the Emperor exclaimed. Outside the bastion, a megalosaurus descended from the sky. The lock had also been unlocked by the half-lich Snade because the crisis had been averted. In order not to destroy King's Landing City, Keyes had to shrink his body to less than 1% of his original size. Even so, he was still so huge that it fascinated people. The legendary monster that was 7 or 8 stories tall was only the size of his palm. He did not even use his breath or spells. He only used his dragon claw to turn the tomb into a ball. A turbulent force field surged out, completely annihilating the legendary monster's body on the molecular level and compressing it into a giant ceramic ball. Stim and the so-called Emperor, the young blue dragon, roared into the sky, and all living creatures within hundreds of parsecs felt an indescribable sense of panic in their hearts. Keyes raised the ceramic ball in his hand and threw it lightly. The remains of the legendary monster streaked across the sky like a meteor and shot into the ocean north of King's Landing City. "Do not disturb the sleeping dragon, for he may awaken at any time and bring you complete and utter destruction." Chapter 835. Keyes returned with unparalleled power, and walked unhurriedly towards the bastion that looked like a model to him. His terrifying psionic powers completely overturned reality, and the marble bastion was instantly reduced to stone fragments that rustled and flowed to the ground. Even the ogre warlord Nalu, every hunchback and bearman warrior within the bastion found themselves in another district of King's Landing in the blink of an eye. With a single thought, Keyes cast a precise group teleportation spell on thousands of people. The Emperor and the god of virtual games, Stim, were no longer afraid to use their greatest imagination to describe the power of the monster that appeared before them. They even suspected that they were being targeted by an ancient evil. Quess was definitely not a god. Both Stim, who had declared himself as a god, and the Emperor, who had done extensive research on the gods, were very sure of it. Otherwise, their understanding of this world would be overturned in an instant. He must be an ancient evil wearing a layer of dragon skin. The Emperor wiped his sweaty forehead, his thoughts running like lightning. Otherwise, what kind of being could stand shoulder to shoulder with a mortal body? No, surpass a god. We must not have anything to do with such a being, or we would definitely be remembered and become a part of their entertainment list. "I'm sorry, great god. Your Excellency Stim, it's better for you to shoulder this calamity." At that thought, the Emperor opened his mouth and chanted a few simple syllables. Stim, who was about to be transformed into a skin bag, paused for a moment as an uncontrollable whisper rang in his ears. It was telling him what he should do now. He raised all four of his arms at once, energy gathering at his fingertips and finally turning into a ball of lightning that shot towards the young blue dragon who was striding towards them. Attacking the blue dragon with a lightning spell, even if it contained divine power, was still a terrible idea. There wasn't even a crackling sound. Like a stream flowing into the sea, the ball of lightning sank into Keys's cobalt scales. The young blue dragon only grinned and slapped the ground, causing a large cloud of dust to rise. Under the effect of the psionic arcana, the dust instantly changed its nature and turned into tiny metal fragments. A powerful magnetic field was activated, and the metal shards were like bullets, sweeping towards Stim and the king from all directions. "Protect me thoroughly," the emperor said softly. The god of virtual games who had become a calamity general couldn't help but take a step forward and stand before the emperor, spreading his four arms to form a barrier as he faced the storm of steel directly. "You bastard!" the god's clone shouted angrily. Enduring the pain of being bombarded by the barrage, he immediately wanted to use divine teleportation to leave this place. But in the end, he found that not only Keys used the dimensional anchor spell on him, but the Emperor also gave the command to fight to the death to this body. There was no other way. All of his divine power could only be used to repair the damage to this body while he charged towards the terrifying Megalosaurus. The extraordinary nature of the gods was largely reflected in their ability to distort reality. As he charged, Stim suddenly conjured a two-handed heavy sword made entirely out of divine power. The weapon was enchanted with a dozen magical effects such as holy damage, extreme sharpness, counter enemy first, and more. There was even a sinister special effect called dragon-slaying weapon mixed in. If a normal Megalosaurus were to take such a blow, even the powerful ancient Megalosaurus would probably be severely injured if not killed instantly. And yet, when Stim's slash came into contact with Keys, it was as if he had struck a shadow. He had entered a quantum state. It went straight through the scales, and in the end, the heavy blow landed completely on the ground. "If you want to fight, let's fight." The young blue dragon raised his head and roared, the tip of his claws gripping the ground that had thousands of cracks, and actually mending the ground in an instant. At the same time, Stim, whose feet had sunk into the ground due to his own attack, was injured once again. Because Keys's strength was too terrifying, the ground that was mended became as hard as diamond under the heavy pressure, and the god of virtual games was squashed into a pile of meat paste from his feet down. He fell to the ground involuntarily. Fortunately, his Azura form had 4 arms, and Stim quickly retreated while sticking close to the ground like a spider. It was also fortunate that he had sharp reflexes, and that was why he was not hit by Keys's follow-up blow. Even so, Keys's terrifying combat ability to severely injure a god's clone in a single exchange still made Stim, who was facing this horror directly, and the Emperor who was looking at it all feel nervous. "Why are you running?" Keys roared. The wings that were folded behind his back suddenly spread open, and the wings that could cover several streets shone with a blinding light. After the adaptive evolution, the blazing crystal, obtained from the Grand Dimensional Laboratory, had formed a thin layer of crystal on his wings. Before diving down from the sky, Keys had already absorbed a large amount of energy from the morning sun, and now this energy was released as pure light. Not only did the light have the characteristics of particles, but it also had the characteristics of waves, and the areas it shone on all shook violently. The Emperor's body that had been reshaped with the help of Calamity's soul was vaporized in the blink of an eye. Stim's clone was in a better condition, but only by a little. Although his body did not seem to be injured on the surface, with large patches of blue veins popping out, the organs inside his body were almost all shattered into pieces. Sharp claws carrying thunderbolts and lightning fell from the sky, nailing Stim's clone to the ground. The young blue dragon suddenly switched to the Ramsey language and said word by word, "God who can't even withstand a single blow, stim, 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 stim." All of King's Landing had heard his declaration, and it wouldn't be long before the news of this god's miserable defeat spread throughout Ramsey. Failure was an unspeakable secret for most of the gods, and widespread failure was a fatal wound for them. As long as they still needed to spread their faith, this kind of failure would definitely have an extremely negative impact on their potential believers. Except for those fanatics who made faith their way of life and the goal they pursued in life, most believers had a utilitarian mentality when it came to giving up their faith. If a god kept failing, believers would feel that they could not protect themselves, and thus would not be willing to give up their faith. Stim was both shocked and angry. Unfortunately, before he could finish his sentence, the combined force field spread through his clone through Keys's fingertip. On a molecular level, the clone was annihilated by the young blue dragon into a pile of ashes. Chapter 836. A man was running, crashing through a thin wall of bark and leaves. Deep in the wood there were primitive sounds everywhere. The canopy of the trees shook. The man was carrying something heavy, and though he could not see the sun, he was sweating all over. He followed the path as far as he could. It was not until just before dark that he found his mark. He followed the path of the firebrand gatherers to a hollow, surrounded by the roots of plants and the stone-studded earth. The thicket was thinning. The mud was trampled hard and showed traces of scorch. He unfolded his bundle and his blanket, took out his few books and clothes, and put a heavy, tightly wrapped object on the centipede-infested earth. It was very cold in the wood, and he made a fire. Then the darkness shut him out, but he kept looking into the shadows, as if waiting for something to appear. There was movement in the vicinity. There was a continuous series of small noises, like the cries of nocturnal birds or the panting and growling of hidden predators. He was very alert. He carried a gun and a long sword. Even in his sleep, he held one or the other in his hand. He watched the time pass by in the light of the fire, sleeping fitfully and at short intervals. Every time he woke up he gasped for breath, as if he had just emerged from the water. He had just suffered a heavy blow, and his face was full of grief and anger. "I will come back," he said. He did not notice the dawn until he could see clearly at the edge of the clearing. He moved stiffly, like a dummy made of twigs, like the cold damp of the night. He chewed his jerky, listened to the noise of the jungle, and paced back and forth in the low mud. At last he heard a voice, and leaning against the edge of the slope, he looked between the trunks of the trees. A man was coming up the path, strewn with leaves and debris. He watched the man, holding his gun tight in his hand. When the man came into the thicker light, he saw his face and lowered his gun. "Here," he shouted. The man stopped dully, looking for his position. He raised his hand and stretched it out over the edge of the hole. It was a tall man, whose hooded robe was even less suited to the forest than his own. The man walked into the depression and stood in front of him. He smiled and said, "Mr. Mitaro, this is the first time we meet. Please take care of me." Seeing the other party take off his hood, revealing the lightning monk's iconic bald skull with a large circuit diagram tattoo, Mitaro finally felt relief. As the backbone of the barbers, before the scales of Eternity Army cleaned up the Yayoi family's mansion, he suddenly received a personal note from the new leader. After receiving the terrible news, he immediately escaped from his family's mansion alone through a secret passage. For 1 day and 1 night, he was as anxious as a stray dog. He only had a limited amount of wealth on him, and all of it was used to pay the merchants who were involved in alcohol smuggling in King's Landing City for using their channels to leave the city. After leaving the city, he immediately took a detour to Razor Trail and entered the boundless forest. He had only managed to run out of Monarch's Descent City's sphere of influence in slightly more than a day's time, arriving near the ruins of Jadewood City, which was later destroyed due to the Emperor's summoning of the Earth God. According to the leader, there would be a lightning monk here to receive him. However, he still had to pay a considerable commission. "The thing you want is here," Mitaro said to the lightning monk as he swept away a pile of leaves used as cover, kicked away a piece of bark, and pointed at the wooden carving that he had dug to hide. At first glance, this wooden carving looked like a crude carving that was directly dug out of dead wood. It was also covered with despicable colors that resembled children's graffiti, and its value was probably not too high. But in reality, it was the opposite. This wooden carving was a very powerful magic item, and it did not emit any magic wave. This is an underwater agarwood carving. Agarwood is also known as the requiem wood, and it can house powerful souls. Moreover, the clay colors were painted with a mixture of blood and paint. There are 99 kinds of paint on this wooden carving. In other words, it has been sacrificed by 99 different lives. This wooden carving can directly be used as a phylactery for a lich, and even a great lich can use it. Hearing Mitaro's self-praising tone, Lightning Monk nodded his head and bent down to lift the wooden carving out of the pit. Because of the hard texture, this wooden carving was much heavier than it looked. "It is indeed a good thing, but you may have made a mistake." Holding the wooden carving under his left arm, the Lightning Monk stretched out a finger. "This wooden carving has only sacrificed 99 lives, there is still one more." A red lightning bolt shot out from the Lightning Monk's fingertips and entered Mitaro's chest. The Japanese merchant, a senior member of the Barber organization, was blown into a mist of blood in an instant. The Lightning Monk threw the wooden carving high, and the flesh fragments flew straight to the carving like young swallows returning to their nest. Then, under the effect of a spell set in advance, the flesh fragments seemed to be re-glued with adhesive, and once again molded into a naked human figure. "Who?" Landing on the ground, the Emperor, who had once again obtained a new body, exhaled a mouthful of turbid air. "Long time no see, great God, we meet again." The Lightning Monk nodded. But suddenly, a noose woven from divine power flew out of his hand and wrapped around the Emperor's neck. "I'm sorry, I chose to believe you the last time we met, but unfortunately, I lost an avatar. So, before this meeting, I've already thought it through. I'm in charge, not you." As he spoke, the Lightning Monk, or to be more precise, the last avatar of the god of virtual games, Stim, pulled the noose in his hand and disappeared with the Emperor. In the blink of an eye, the god brought the Emperor across the barrier of space and appeared in a magnificent temple. He returned directly from the Ramsey continent to Dwarf Island. After all, after witnessing the terrifying power of the Megalosaurus, his sense of security had dropped to the lowest point. If it wasn't for the fact that he wanted to bring the Emperor back, he would never have left his last incarnation in Ramsey for so long. Holding the noose in his hand and pulling the Emperor, who was tied up like a dumpling, the god walked step by step to the high platform in the middle of the temple. He sat on his opal throne and picked up a brass bell from the armrest of the throne. Along with the tinkling of bells, priests wearing dark blue clergy robes walked in from the various entrances of the shrine one after another. "I declare," Stim said softly, but his voice was deafening in the ears of every priest. "From now on, the Church and the entire territory of Dwarf Island shall enter a state of war readiness. Ye shall immediately take over the Steam Hall. No matter what protests the followers of the dwarf god may have, ye only need to bring them before me." Chapter 837. The sailors scanned the horizon and oiled the cannons from time to time. This was a long and narrow strait. There were hundreds of small islands and trading towns that could not be clearly seen on nautical charts. On the other side of the strait, the commercial needs of King's Landing City were like a bottomless pit. There was an endless supply of ships. Thus, there was a period of time when the pirates of Joms often appeared here, doing business without capital. The sky was filled with flying machines. There were single-person propeller-driven flying machines that looked like bees circling a beehive. There were oddly shaped cargo airships that transported heavy goods between ships. There were unique single-person balloons with pendulum-like seats hanging from them. There were also combat airships a little further away. They were the oval-shaped flying cannons. The most eye-catching one was the huge flagship of the Leviathan, the Nephremon Dis. A huge fleet of more than 50 ships, coupled with the flying machines that blotted out the sky. Any large sea beast or pirate with a bit of rationality would choose to temporarily avoid them. Only a few schools of fish chased after them, wantonly enjoying the organic bait that was poured into the sea through the sewage holes. As the ships split the waves, white foam gathered on the surface of the sea, like a pot of boiling soup. Compared to the calm of the fleet's voyage, there was a different scene on the sea. Hundreds of paressons. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the surface of the sea. A curtain of rain hit the small ship, pouring onto the thick oak deck. The sea was turbulent, and the small ship was in danger of being swallowed. It shook on the surface of the sea, rising and falling with the waves. A man stuck to the rigging, trying to raise the sails and regain some control of the ship. He was completely soaked. His long black hair was wrapped around his head, and the water on his hair flowed down his bare chest. The wet and heavy pants made it difficult for him to maintain his balance. But in the end, he managed to hold the sails in place. He could finally breathe a sigh of relief. As the first mate, he had warned his boss before they set off that such a situation could happen at sea, so they needed a new crew. But Numan had insisted that a dozen old pirates from Joms would be enough to handle everything. They might even be able to find other companions during the voyage. What a terrible idea, the first mate complained in his heart. He clung to the mast and climbed down. The slightest mistake would have thrown him overboard with his life hanging in the balance. The storm hit him in the face, tearing at his skin and pants. He stood on the deck, clinging to the mast for support. At the stern of the ship, he could see Captain Numan playing a game with the rudder. The 6-foot-tall man was grinning. The first mate thought gloomily, "That's right, he wants to kill himself just like that." Suddenly, the ship tilted to one side. The first mate held on to the mast tightly, like a drowning man holding on to a precious life-saving straw. Numan, who was fiddling with the wheel, was thrown to the side of the ship. Fortunately, the lifeline tied to his waist caught him. The first mate didn't even dare to breathe loudly as he stared at the captain who was crawling on the deck. But Numan did not seem to care. He managed to turn over and return to the rudder. "Don't worry," yelled Narman at the top of his voice. Strangely enough, even though the waves were surging, his voice was clearly heard by every sailor on the Ghostface Fish. Even those who were still below deck were no exception. "Our new ship will never capsize. You're all lucky. Below deck, listen up. Take care of those little cuties for me." By little cuties, he meant the military horses that were kept on the lower deck. They were all placed in large wooden cages. The cages were tied with ropes and hung from the top of the deck without touching the ground. That way, the horses would suffer less in the cages, and they would be less likely to fall ill from the tossing of the waves. They would be of great use in the near future. The Ghostface Fish sailed northwestward through the storm for a whole night. At last, it was out of the sea. The sun had not yet risen. In the dim light of dawn, rocks rose from the water below. It was difficult to judge the size and distance of the land. The rocks, which were not very large, were scattered like the backs of whales. There were no birds or animals on them, only brown stones and green bushes. The Ghostface Fish sailed into a lagoon. The details of the sea became clear. The dark blue sea surface that was originally wrinkled gradually showed the shape of waves. The foam and water flow could also be distinguished. Under the water, there were black reefs and colorful kelp group. "We will reach the shore in an hourglass," Narman's voice rang out again in the ears of every sailor. The captain's words were proved correct. After an hourglass of sailing, the ship passed between the lagoons. An island appeared in front of the Ghostface Fish. It was located in the cold northern ocean, but it was lush and full of vitality. The island was about 300 leagues long and 100 wide. Where the ship was about to reach the shore, the terrain was rugged and covered with dull gray mountains and hills. Clearly, it was not a suitable place for landing. The gnomes live to the west of the mountain range. The coastline there is a natural ice-free harbor. All the ships that trade with the gnomes will dock at those places. Naman was standing on the head of a ferocious demon statue at the bow of the ship. He was giving an impassioned speech in an impassioned voice. The target of his speech was the dozen or so crew members who were busy dragging the sick military horses out of the cabin after the voyage. For us Jom's heroes, it doesn't matter where we go ashore. We don't know how to do business. If we want something, we have to snatch it ourselves. After resting for 2 hourglasses, the war horses finally regained their strength. The pirates of Joms rode on them and set off. They left the Ghostface fish at the shore. The first mate wanted to leave 2 people to watch the ship, but Narman insisted on taking all the sailors with him. Don't worry. You don't know what this ship can do. We just have to snatch it, and there will be people who will help us. Unable to dissuade the captain, the first mate could only keep quiet. A dozen or more of them, mounted on more than 30 horses, both rotated and equipped for baggage, set out swiftly from the coast. Before they set sail from King's Landing, Narman had studied the geography of Dwarf Island. He knew that there were a few small paths in the mountain range. It was not suitable for an army to pass through, but it was not a problem for a dozen or so people. As long as they passed through these small paths, they would reach the heart of the only city on Dwarf Island. Then they could carry out their plan. Chapter 838. The pirates of Jomus looked over the bushes, trees, and brambles to see the vast expanse of land on the other side. The farms that provided the steam city with a small amount of food were spread across the long, narrow, and winding spiral plains, and this was the end of the field. The steam engines that moved on caterpillar tracks were either working among the crops, plowing the black soil, or setting fire to the stalks. Cruise ships shuttled back and forth leisurely. It looked like they were sailing through the fields, but that was because the mud and vegetation on both sides of the canal blocked the view. The ships went back and forth between the city and the country villas endlessly, bringing fuel and alchemy potions, stones, cement, and all kinds of luxury goods. Then, they carried the food through the vast fields of mansions and mills back to the city. Most of the dwarves lived in the city, but a few wealthy families still built their own farms on the spiral plains in the hinterland of Jomus Island. Although Jomus Island relied on the Ramsey continent to transport most of its food, the spices and gath meat produced from the farms were still very popular among the dwarves of the steam city. It was an indispensable part of their diet. Unlike the propaganda when the currency exchange center was opened on the Ramsey continent, the dwarves still did not approve of the idea of storing their wealth in institutions run by other people. Therefore, the dwarven families that ran farms would usually build a treasure vault in their own country mansions to keep their wealth safe. And these treasures were the goal of Narman's trip. The Cromnite family, the largest supplier of gath meat in the steam city. Narman hid the title of a family of devout believers of the god of virtual games because it was useless to motivate the pirates and might even reveal their strategic intentions. They are among the top 10 wealthiest families on Jomus Island. It is said that every crack in their family's treasure vault is welded shut with screwed steel rods. We will soon be able to see if this rumor is true, and help them use up some of their treasures that they can never use up. The contract demon, who was draped in a muscular Jomus skin, laughed heartily. His laughter infected the dozen or so riders around him who were riding side by side on the saddle. Hearing their leader's introduction, all the pirates of Jorms became excited. Some of them even began to organize their mounts' saddlebags so that they would be able to carry more treasures when the time came. Accompanied by a whistle, a dozen military horses rushed down the embankment one after another, galloping on the winding road close to the waterway. The crawler steam engine gatekeepers working on both sides of the river turned a deaf ear to this and were still immersed in the instructions related to farm work such as weeding, plowing, and feeding the garth beast as stipulated by the core code. In fact, because it was located in the hinterland of Dwarf Island, the security of the swirl plains had always been exceptionally good. Therefore, the large families who had built farms in the countryside only had a limited number of guards here. They could not compare with the pirates at all. They lined up in a row and charged towards the Cromnett family's mansion. The guards of the Cromnett family had just picked up their weapons that they had not used for a long time when they were immediately drowned by the bullets fired from the rechargeable machine guns. These were the latest infantry weapons of the scale of perpetual order that Naaman had obtained through certain private channels before he left. They were instantly put to the ground. Naaman led the charge, carrying a cylindrical launcher on his shoulder. He pressed a button, and an oval-shaped cannonball shot out of the launcher, leaving behind a bright trail of flames as it crashed into the Cromnett family's country mansion. The sound of the explosion swept across the quiet field and traveled a long distance. When the dust settled, a group of pirates had already charged into the mansion with guns in hand. After some symbolic resistance, these Jomas people arrived at the door of the treasury. As expected, every crack has been welded shut by the threaded steel rods, Naaman said to his subordinates as he caressed the steel walls of the treasury. He took a pickaxe made of expensive adamantine from one of his subordinates and chiseled 2 finger-sized holes in the steel wall with a couple of clicks. He inserted 2 electrode rods into the holes and connected them to a lead zinc battery with a lead wire. He then splashed a large amount of highly corrosive alchemy potion on the wall. Then, under the effect of the electric current, the highly corrosive alchemy potion began to rapidly melt the steel wall. Not long after, a hole big enough for a person to pass through was eroded out of the wall. "What are you waiting for?" Naaman pursed his lips as he looked at his subordinates, whose eyes were red from the smoke. "Why aren't you rushing in and saving those little treasures that are almost permanently hidden in a place that will never see the light of day? Hurry up, we still have many families to visit." Amidst the cheers of "Long live the leader," the Jomas pirates began to loot like ants moving house. They filled their pockets with loot that they could take away and put many things into the saddlebags of their horses. However, due to Naaman's strict orders, no one dared to throw away their weapons and ammunition. If you throw away the things that feed you, then you won't be able to eat in the future. In less than half an hourglass, the pirates had completely retreated from the mansion of the Cromnetters and rushed to their next target location. On the way, Naaman kept urging them and took the lead to throw some items that were not very valuable: the various game cartridges released by the Temple of Stemus, the various rights badges of the Temple of Stemus, the annual card of the Temple of Stemus, all of them were thrown on the road. They cleaned up as they went. Within a day they had visited more than a dozen mansions of the dwarf families in the countryside, taking away a lot of gold and silver products, alchemy materials, and magic items. However, they also left behind enough waste that could be traced. The Dwarf Investigation Bureau in the city had originally been analyzing all kinds of information sent back from the Ramsey continent according to the latest instructions from the Shrine of Steam, so as to avoid being caught off guard in the upcoming war. However, the patriarchs of more than a dozen large families had joined forces to put pressure on the Investigation Bureau, so they had no choice but to deploy their few men to arrest the bandits that were causing trouble in the countryside. The robbery by Naaman and his men did not stop there. This was because they had taken away a batch of blueprints from the treasure vault of a dwarven clan famed for their manufacturing, and were about to be handed over to the Shrine of Stim. That was why they had alerted several priests in the Shrine of Stim. The divine servants had no choice but to take action in person, bringing investigators and a large number of troops to join in the pursuit. Hundreds of dwarf riders on mechanical chocobos followed the hoofprints, droppings, and all kinds of worthless treasures left behind by the bandits all the way to the barren coastal mountains in the east of Dwarf Island. Chapter 839. It was the last season of the year, and the rain never stopped. Thus, in the depths of the spiral plains, some of the abandoned farmlands had turned into icy swamps. Droplets of water dripped from the branches. Looking into the distance, the silhouettes of the trees looked as if they had been inked onto the clouds. They were wet and not yet completely dry. A flock of geese chirped as they flew over the horses. The smell of tree sap mixed with the smell of soil made those who smelled it feel that the low sky was gray and cramped. It was early in the morning. Under the blinding red light, the floating leaves and vines looked like paint dripping into water, drifting away and gradually dissolving. Standing on a small hill, Naaman could see the steamboats chasing after them on the waterway of the spiral plains. They brought with them black smoke and rumbling sounds. "It's time to go." Naaman woke up his pirate subordinates who had been sleeping for several hourglasses. The sun had yet to rise. Because it had rained all night, the waterway had widened and merged into a swamp. Also, because the wetland lake was adjacent to the edge of the karst terrain, there were strange stone pillars everywhere. Therefore, the steamboats of the Gnome Research Department had to slow down to prevent them from deviating from the waterway where the banks could no longer be seen. To the pirates of Joms, the slowing down of their pursuers was definitely good news. After 2 days of hiding and robbing, even if they had enough energy potions as a foundation, although they weren't physically exhausted, they were mentally exhausted. Compared to that, the horses carrying them were much better. As long as they had enough energy potions, ate their fill, and slept for a while, they could run for half a day. "Leader, where are we going?" After they set off, the first mate on horseback approached Naaman and asked in a low voice, "Some of our brothers are already panicking. They rarely come ashore, and they haven't boarded for such a long time. There's a swamp up ahead. That's the territory of the swamp people." Naaman didn't look at the first mate and smiled as he said loudly. He wanted everyone to hear his words, and those people did indeed hear him. They all stared at their leader with wide eyes. There was a swamp people's territory on Dwarf Island? Anyone with some sense would think that this was a joke. After all, this was the home of the dwarves of the Ramsey Plain. Not a single blade of grass, tree, insect, or beast could escape the control of the dwarves. How could the dwarves allow evil creatures like the swamp men to settle in the hinterland of the swirling plains? Propagate and pass down the ancestral line? The logical reasoning of the pirates of Joms was not wrong. However, they didn't know about the ghost face fish that had brought them to Dwarf Island. That ship was actually a leviathan. Just like the Nephrimandis and their current leader, Naaman, the ghost face fish was also a product of other creatures being leviathan, by Keyes using his flesh regeneration technology. That ship had once been an airship, and before that was a powerful pit fiend. After bringing the pirates to Gnome Island, the ghost-face fish used a high-level teleportation spell to go to many places in the Ramsey Plain. It captured a large number of creatures that should not have appeared on this island and brought them back to Gnome Island. The purpose of this was to create a game. "We're going to play a game of survival with those dwarves." Holding the reins, Naaman brought the group to the side of a swamp. He picked up a rock by his feet and threw it out. The stone fell into the water and made a muffled splash. Then, this seemingly calm swamp turned into a pot of boiling hot soup in the blink of an eye. Swampmen with webbed hands and feet, large eyes and extremely wide mouths leapt out of the water one by one. A pair of bulbous eyes protruded from their toad-like heads, and their green skin was covered in warts and protrusions. Swampmen can stand 5 feet tall and weigh close to 200 pounds. These creatures have a theoretical lifespan of 50 years. Of course, the harsh swamps and infighting usually shorten their lifespan. Their lives begin as tadpoles in the breeding pool. They can grow up to 3 feet long before they grow their hands and feet, and can live on land afterward. After successfully killing a humanoid, the clan will accept the young swampmen, and the losers will be exiled. They will continue to grow and lose their color throughout the lifetime of a swampman. A few especially old swampmen have completely white skin and extremely fat bodies. Just like that fellow over there. Due to the magical effects of the swampman's croaks, mortals within 30 feet of them would usually fall into a state of trembling when they heard the terrifying croaking. Even though the pirates of Joms were known for their audacity, there were hundreds of swampmen in the swamp. It was difficult for them not to be affected by the croaking. That was why Naman began to explain the creature's habits and characteristics. Humans were like that. Fear often stemmed from the unknown. The more they understood, the easier it was for their courage to be stimulated. With Naman's explanation, his subordinates gradually calmed down. Their hands no longer trembled. They held their weapons firmly and aimed at the swampmen outlaws who were baring their fangs and claws as they prepared to pounce on the shore. They were ready to fire. However, Naman stopped them. He began to shout at the swampmen in Boggart. For a leviathan creature that was transformed from a packed demon, Naman could speak any language that could be used by living creatures just by opening his mouth. He spoke Pagadar with greater fluency than even the young swampmen who were approaching. In their clans, only the oldest elders could speak like this. That was why the young swampmen all stopped 10 feet away from the shore. That was the furthest their sticky tongues could attack. Stopping outside that range was a clear indication that they were unwilling to resort to violence for the time being. After a short while, the white and fat swampman elder that Naman had seen before arrived at the shore, escorted by dozens of sturdy swampman warriors who wore armor made of tanned leather and shells. He stopped a dozen feet away as well. Croak. Who are you, and why do you speak my language? There was no concept of we in Boggart, since the entire clan could be considered the elder's personal property. Naman grinned at the swampman elder. He took out a bundle of licorice sticks from the saddlebag of his mount and tossed them at the swampman. Just as the licorice was about to fall into the mouth, a long tongue covered in mucus instantly intercepted it, and it was quickly sucked back into the elder's fat mouth. How did you know I like this licorice? You're carrying food on you? Greed and urgency leaked out of the swampman elder's light-bulb-sized round eyes, as if he would order his clansmen to ransack Na-men and the others in the next moment just to find a few more licorice sticks to satisfy his craving. Chapter 840. The Swampman Elders are the owners of their clans. They are happy to have their clans serve their eccentricities, Naman explained to his men after they left the swamp. Not only were they not raided, they even managed to trick the Swampman Elder into setting up an ambush for the dwarf trackers after revealing the fact that every dwarf chocobo rider had such a bundle of licorice sticks in their field rations to the Swampman Elder. However, while they were in awe of their leader's knowledge, the Yorm's pirates did not think of a question. When did the Swampman Elder become addicted to the taste of licorice sticks? The answer was 10 years ago. Back when King's Landing was first established, Naman had traversed the entire Ramsey Plain alone. In the vast Black Willow Swamp, he disguised himself and fed hundreds of Swampman Elders the snacks of licorice stick. In the end, only one Swampman Elder became addicted to the food. After that, the spies of the Scale of Perpetual Order would secretly place licorice sticks in the Elder's territory on a regular basis. Similarly, there was a group of harpies who were addicted to collecting gnome jewelry, a few golems who were addicted to eating the steel forged by the gnomes, a hunting group of gnolls who were obsessed with the flesh of the gnomes, and chimeras who were jealous of the gnomes' treasures. It took Naman 10 years to find these monsters all over the Ramsey Plain. The reason he did not use spells to force them to attack the gnomes was because of the game he was playing today. 10 years was not a long time, considering the devil's ability to set things up. According to Key's instructions, he had dragged the virtual game into reality and used it to strike a blow to Key's divine title. By the time the Gnome Research Bureau's steamship fleet had entered the swampmen stacked rocks beneath the surface of the water. The monsters had glued them together with the mucus secreted from their glands, were quickly dragged along by the steamship. With a series of crunching noises, the swampmen floated to the surface of the water one after another. It was as if they could stand on the surface of the water as they attacked wildly. They threw the spears in their hands. Arcs of water connected to the spears under their arms like harpoons. The gnomes on the ships used small naval cannons to attack the surface of the water. However, this caused the swampmen to react even more violently. Around the damaged hulls of the steamboats, tall water pillars suddenly rose. No one would think that those were strange waves. Those water columns were more than 20 feet tall. Because of the mud mixed in, the water column appeared very murky. At the top of each water column stood several elite swampman warriors. They descended from the sky and pounced on the deck of the steamship. Although each steamship had a few robotic chocobo riders accompanying them, the space on the deck was limited, and these warriors equipped with advanced weaponry could not effectively attack the swamps. When the first steamship ran aground and gradually capsized, the pilots of the other steamships all turned the rudders and steered the ships towards the swamp shore. With an ear-piercing screech, they rushed to the shallows on the shore. Some of the gnomes and swampmen who could not keep their footing fell from the bow of the ship, landing heavily on the ground. The steamships were like inclined ramp. The robotic chocobo riders hidden under the decks quickly landed on the deck. They gathered on the shore and began to turn the tide of the battle. After a difficult battle, although the gnomes had the advantage in firepower, they finally managed to drive away the swampmen clans. However, they still paid the price of one steamship sinking, 4 steamships severely damaged, more than 30 gnomes injured, and more than a dozen robotic chocobo riders killed. Their bodies were dragged into the swamp. Moreover, they were confused by the sudden battle. Where did these monsters come from? Almost all the survivors had a lot of questions in their minds. The gnome investigators began to use the portable communication devices they carried with them to frantically request for backup from the steam city. At the same time, they all retreated from the shore as far as possible. However, before the reinforcements from the steam city could arrive, they were attacked by several hunting groups of gnolls. Their originally organized formation was scattered. Unable to take care of each other, the smaller number of gnomes who were separated could only rely on the speed and stamina of the robotic chocobos to escape. However, the gnolls were also known for their stamina. It was actually very difficult to break out of the encirclement. When the reinforcements arrived, a large number of robotic chocobo riders used light and heavy firepower to finish off the gnoll hunting group. They began to split up to search for possible survivors. In the end, they only found some severed limbs and even more mysterious corpses that did not seem to have been eaten by gnolls. Instead, they were pecked to death by some birds. Furthermore, the dwarves seemed to have been robbed before they died. Not only were their clothes and jewels stripped clean, even the mechanical chocobos they rode on were torn to pieces. At this point in the operation, no matter how careless the gnomes were, they began to realize that something was not quite right. They hurriedly gathered their troops and prepared to return to the steamship before making further plans. However, just as they were on their way back to the city, they were attacked by a chimera that had gone berserk. Unlike swampmen, gnolls, and suspected harpies and other creatures that were interested in eating metal, chimeras did not appear in group. However, they were a more difficult monster to deal with. These winged monsters had the body of a lion, with 2 additional heads protruding from each side of its head. Usually, it was a dragon's head and a goat's head with horns. However, the chimera that attacked the gnomes was obviously an exception. It did not have the lion's or goat's heads. All 3 of its heads were dragon's heads. In other words, it was much more difficult to deal with than a normal chimera. Because of the different types of heads, it could use the breath of a white dragon, a green dragon, and a red dragon. bone-chilling frost, corrosive acid, scorching flames, as well as a sneak attack that descended from the sky, the chimera tore the returning gnomes to shreds in an instant. Even though it was killed, it had slaughtered nearly half of the gnomes before it died. When this series of events spread, the steamship city, no, the entire gnome island, was shocked. The aristocratic families, who were still living in their villas in the countryside, all brought their elders and children to hide in the steamship city overnight. The guards in the city were on duty throughout the night. When dawn came the next day, the army that had gathered immediately poured out of the city gates. Chapter 841. Over the past few days, the bandits and monster attacks that had mysteriously appeared were like glue, bridging the dissension and rift between the various factions of dwarves caused by the forceful seizure of power by the servants of the god of virtual games. From a certain point of view, this seemed to be a good thing. However, as blessings and misfortunes lay within blessings, these incidents had also caused other consequences, especially for the god of virtual games, Stim. As the situation grew more serious, the emotions of many of the residents on Dwarf Island were fluctuating. According to the statistics compiled by the priests of the temple, the number of people on the island who played the virtual game for 5 hourglasses or more had greatly decreased compared to before. As a result, Stim's steady growth of divine power had gradually slowed down. In order to reconstruct his clone, he even had to use what little divine power he had left. What was worse was that Stim felt a deeper sense of threat. The bandits and monster attacks seemed to be some sort of game. Even though it was happening not in the virtual world but in reality, it was still connected to the game. Therefore, his failure in the game, Stim did not want to admit this, had even caused the divinity of the game to become estranged from the divinity of the game. A god must fulfill his divinity. If he could not fulfill his duties, his divinity would gradually become estranged, then abandoned, and finally stripped away. If Stim, who had just reached the standard of a lesser god, suddenly lost his core divinity of game, he would not even have the chance to turn things around and would instantly be demoted to the mortal realm. That kind of result was completely unacceptable to him. I need a victory. Stim's last clone, sitting in the middle of the temple, had a furious look on his face. The clergy, who were kneeling on the lapis lazuli floor like ostriches, trembled as they felt the wrath of their god. The emperor was tied up like a dumpling by chains formed from divine power, his mouth sealed. He was hung upside down from the ceiling of the temple by Stim, watching this interesting farce from a unique perspective. Stim stood up. The skin he was using now was not the lightning monk he had used in the Ramsey continent, but the body of a young and slightly plump dwarf. He stretched out a finger, and a map of the entire dwarf island was projected onto the floor of the temple. Every mountain and river was vivid and lifelike. The fog of war has been dispelled, God's incarnation said in a deep voice. He had already sent Mu with the sacred artifacts to follow the army of the City of Steam to various parts of Dwarf Island. The artifacts they carried were like signal towers, allowing Stim to see the entire Dwarf Island with a very small amount of divine power. As a god whose job was to run a game, Stim naturally knew all sorts of ways to gain an asymmetrical and immoral advantage in the game. Cheating must die. Although he had issued oracles more than once to punish game participants who tried to use these methods in the game, he did not feel guilty about using them himself in order to win. The bandits have been circling the ring-shaped mountain range for 2 days. Stim's incarnation pointed at the icon representing the pirates of Namen on the map and snapped his stubby fingers. The continuous drizzle will make them tired, the sudden earthquake will cut off their path, and the frequent appearance of wild beasts may cause them to lose members. The divine power undetectable by mortals made his words come true one by one. Not only did this guy use a see-through hack, but he also changed the terrain for his competitors. Mobilize all the airships in the City of Steam and carry the mechanical chocobo riders. We must eliminate all the bandits today. Among the priests kneeling in front of him, an old dwarf over 200 years old raised his head. Great God, your will is our command. However, according to the results of the investigation, a large fleet is now sailing towards Dwarf Island. It is so large that only the King's Landing city of the scale of perpetual order can organize it in the entire Ramsey Plain. Therefore, all the guards in the City of Steam have been adjusted to Level 1 combat response status. If the airships are deployed now, I'm afraid. In fact, Stim knew that the dwarf priest was right. However, when he considered the threat that the game posed to the stability of his priesthood, his attitude wavered. He interrupted the priest. Therefore, we must eliminate all the bandits as soon as possible. That way, the airships can return as soon as possible and continue their defense mission. Although his tone was displeased, the god of virtual games did not punish the priest who raised the suggestion. Instead, he raised the dwarf priest's level on the spot and appointed him as the field priest who would accompany the airships. Half an hourglass later, the airships departed from the City of Steam. In the Temple of Virtual Games, only Stim's avatar and the Emperor, who was hanging upside down from the ceiling, were left. The army is approaching. When the seal on his mouth was removed, the Emperor's first sentence was a statement of fact. The expeditionary army of King's Landing City is about to reach the shore, and the priesthood related to the game does not tolerate failure. You seem to be caught in a dilemma. The former question was what the Emperor heard while he was hanging from the ceiling, while the latter was what he deduced from his understanding of the gods. You should know. Stim's avatar crooked his finger, and the Emperor hung from the ceiling to the ground, but the divine rope around his body was not untied. I let you speak, not out of mercy. If you can only contribute some meaningless content, then I don't mind being unable to speak forever. Mercy and forgiveness are not the domain of my priesthood. The Emperor nodded, and from Stim's perspective, he merely craned his neck. As you wish, great god of virtual games, he continued. But why do you want me to say it? I mean, the method I'm about to say, isn't it something you've already thought of? Upload all the consciousness of the dwarves in the City of Steam, and turn them into a special petitioner that lives in your hidden servers all over the Ramsey Plain. Then, transform their bodies into monsters to fight against King's Landing City. Stim lowered his head and stared into the Emperor's eyes. Chapter 842. After a long delay, the storm finally arrived. It was as if a dense mass of air had suddenly been released. It was a hot night. Lightning flashed and thunder rumbled. Rain pounded on the steam city. The ropes and rigging on the docks swayed and lashed at the ships moored at the docks and the side walls of the buildings on the shore. This was the first real storm that the steam city had faced in a long time, but the local gnomes reacted skillfully and professionally. Various small airships quickly descended to the ground and hid in the temporary open space under the rain, waiting for the weather to improve. The large airships could not hide in the rain, but they were temporarily transferred from the city to participate in the bandit suppression mission in the ring-shaped mountains. Fortunately, there was no need for shelter. Throughout the city, except for the sturdiest bridges and chains, all the other resiliently connected buildings had one end removed to prevent the wind from moving too fast and too far and breaking them. When the storm came, it was impossible to travel through the steam city. Inside the breakwater, in the narrow gaps between the ships, the water shook violently, but it could not form waves. The seawater that hit the ships outside the city had no such restrictions. The ships at the entrance of the sea urchin Thorn all gathered together to form a wall to protect the merchant ships inside. Large warships, tugboats, and ships that could not enter the breakwater sailed to a distant fjord to avoid being pushed to the outer wall of the port. Through one of the windows in the corridor of the temple, Stim's clone looked out for a moment, before turning back to look at the Emperor, who was still bound like a dumpling by his divine chains. There will be a storm even more powerful than this. The Emperor could not speak or express his opinion. He could only nod. He was well aware of the cause of this storm. Even if Stim was not a god who controlled the divine titles of wind and storm, he could still use more divine power to change the weather if he wanted. Tonight, the Steam City will implement a quota power supply system, Stim said. He was not trying to explain anything to the Emperor, but just looking for someone to listen to. When there are 2 hourglasses, the communication equipment in the Dry Falls district will not work, and the suspension bridge there will be unlocked, so the residents living in that neighborhood will lose contact with the entire Steam City for 2 hourglasses. That's enough, and even a little more time, the Emperor said in his heart. However, he still couldn't say anything. Even if he didn't have any resistance to what he was going to do next, he might even be a little eager to give it a try. However, Stim still wouldn't let him speak. It was as if every word he said would offend this great god. As if he was walking a dog, Stim led the Emperor into the rain, and their figures disappeared. When he reappeared, he was already in the center of the Dry Waterfall District. The Dry Waterfall District was a satellite town of the Steam City. It was located at the top of a cliff 3 to 4 miles north of the city. The reason why it was named Dry Waterfall was because there was a waterfall on the cliff where the town was located. But as the city developed, the river was diverted by the dwarfs to the central water plant of Steam City, which was used for the daily drinking water of more than 1 million dwarfs. Some civilians still remained in the Dry Waterfall district. Most of them would use the suspension bridge to walk down the cliff and take the train to the factories in the Steam City to work. Due to the fact that the dry cliffs were suitable for rock climbing, there were also some gnomes who sought thrills and weren't very keen on virtual games who moved here from the city one after another, so that they could enjoy all sorts of extreme sports. The official population of this town was more than 20,000, but a quarter of them probably didn't live here all year round. So when Stim used his divine power to investigate, he found that the population of the Dry Waterfall district was only about 10,000. The others must have received the storm warning and returned to their residences in the city to spend the night before the suspension bridge was dismantled. "Let me see what you can do again," Stim said as he shook the divine chains. The Emperor's hands were immediately freed so that he could cast spells. After that, the god still didn't say a word as he stared at the storm clouds rolling toward the Steam City. It seemed that he didn't care if the Emperor was going to do something or attack him from behind. "As you wish," the Emperor said in his heart. He turned his back to Stim and stretched out 2 palms that glowed with a pale blue light. Like fireflies flashing with a strange light, clusters of cold lines shot out from his fingertips. This was the soul cocoon that the Emperor had created using the souls of the Tribulation Generals. Each of the Tribulation Generals was his apprentice, and they each inherited a part of the Emperor's knowledge and power. But as their teacher, the Emperor didn't choose to share much of his knowledge with his apprentices. The soul cocoon sank into the ground and then gathered into a gurgling stream that rushed to the various houses in the Dry Waterfall district. The residents who didn't realize the danger were soon all entangled by these soul parasites that specialized in possession. The soul cocoon broke in their bodies, and their weak mortal souls were instantly squeezed out of their bodies and fell into a state of confusion. Of course, this was only a temporary trance state. Even though the Emperor's magic power was profound, he still could not erase the connection between the souls and the bodies of all the dwarfs by performing soul cocoon possession on more than 10,000 people at the same time. If no one interfered, the souls would return to their bodies in another half an hourglass. At the same time, they would also digest the soul worms that had just hatched from the soul cocoon. It was just that Stim had helped him out. After the Emperor finished his work, the god of virtual games tossed out a divine artifact that he carried with him. This strange object that looked like a metal furnace floated in the air and emitted rays of brilliant light. Under the guidance of the light, the souls of the dwarfs that were hovering outside their bodies all floated towards this strange object. Like a kettle that was slowly filling up, the metal furnace became heavier and heavier as it contained more and more souls. It landed on the ground, causing cracks to appear on the stone tiles on the ground. When the last soul entered, a large cloud of steam suddenly spewed out from the top of the metal furnace. The gears embedded in it started to operate, and electricity flowed through the buried wires. The souls were stripped of impurities such as self, and became purer, infinitely reaching the level of petitioners. "Upload new life," Stim muttered. Then, the metal furnace disappeared from the ground. "The monster is out of the cage," the Emperor commented in his mind as he watched everything that happened in the dry waterfall district. Chapter 843. The Nephremon Dis was the first to charge into the storm. It used its fearless spirit and huge body to set an example for the following troop. In fact, it did much more than that. Thanks to the biofurnace created by the Leviathan transformation and the thermonuclear reactor installed by the master engineer Shea, it could release surging heat to the outside world with extremely high power. The heat rose and continued to resist the sinking cold air, dispersing the tornadoes that always wanted to appear in the path of the flying ships and the fleet. Even if it was not enough to resist the change in weather due to the intervention of the gods, in a sense, the Nephremon Dis still provided sufficient shelter for the advancing troops. It was only in such a storm that the fleet could continue to sail towards Dwarf Island. On the surface of the sea, the leading ship was a giant aircraft carrier called the Eastern Mighty Might. If the Nephremon Dis embodied the power of Leviathan's biological technology, then it was the naked symbol of the power of machinery. The power provided by 16 super-large turbocharged engines allowed the steel giant ship to maintain a speed of 20 knots. The 30-foot-tall waves were not even half the height of the ship's side. The expeditionary force of King's Landing City was invincible and unstoppable as it rushed towards the enemy's lair. Every soldier who belonged to the battle sequence remembered their mission: to kill the Emperor who brought damage to the scale of perpetual order and punish the false god Stim who was in cahoots with him. They did not doubt the rationality of this war, just as they did not doubt that they would win. When they were about 30 miles away from Dwarf Island, the bridge control tower of the Eastern Mighty Might reported to the fleet that they were about to approach the enemy's territory. On the deck of the steel ships behind, ironwood totem poles about 6 feet in diameter and 12 feet in height rose. According to the flow of the previous drill, the elemental shamans on the ships removed the seals in order. In order to inject magic into these large totem poles, more than 300 elemental shamans worked together. On average, each totem pole stored the magic accumulated by 10 elemental shamans for more than 30 days. As the seals were removed, the totem poles linked with each other and released energy, equivalent to tens of thousands of elemental shamans casting spells at the same time. As a result, the vast sea was instantly tamed by the fleet. Every drop of seawater was an ally of the monarch's Descent City army. The sea, which had become violent due to the storm, became calm as it approached the fleet. The monstrous waves that swept over from afar only left behind ripples when they reached this place. There was nothing that could escape the elemental surveillance and launch a sneak attack on the fleet, such as the tens of thousands of monsters that were hiding at the bottom of the sea. "There's something under the water." The elemental shamans on each ship, who were in charge of the totem poles, noticed this almost at the same time. They immediately used the communication devices they carried with them to gather information from the command tower. Not long after, every ship received feedback. The command tower authorized them to launch a wave of free attack. Target 300 feet below the surface of the sea. Countdown to the deployment of cluster depth charges. Those folded mechanical arms suddenly stretched out from the deck of the ship. In the blink of an eye, the steel ships of Monarch's Descent City looked like floating water demons. Below the deck, the sailors were busy hanging the cluster depth charges from the ammunition hold onto the hooks of the transmission device. The electric motor buzzed, and the bombs were pulled onto the mechanical arm one by one. Then, they fell into the sea with a plop. After about 10 breaths, the cluster depth charges dived to the predetermined depth. Under the pressure of the seawater, the pressure detonators inside the bombs were activated. The various alchemy potions mixed together and suddenly exploded into balls of fire. Because the bombs were designed in a cluster, smaller bombs were ejected from the body of the bombs and continued to cause destruction outside the radius of the explosion. Violent shock waves rampaged under the surface of the sea. And because the sea had been tamed by the elemental power, these shock waves strangely did not rush to the surface of the sea. This also caused the shock waves to be more intense in the horizontal direction and transmitted to the bottom of the sea. Therefore, the ships floating on the surface of the sea were not affected. Only the monsters hidden under the sea suffered all the damage from this chain of explosions. The explosions were so violent, so much so that although there were a large number of monster remains that had been torn into pieces, kneaded into dough shapes, and folded into the shape of a fried dough twist floating on the surface of the sea, the surviving monsters still emerged from the surface of the sea and roared in an unknown language as they launched what could be called a suicide attack on the steel ships. Only then did the observers of the fleet see the true appearance of these monsters. They are like monsters with legs and hands. Their bodies are grayish-brown. There is a big mouth on their faces that is filled with rows of intersecting teeth. It occupies the most important part of the ball-shaped body of this creature. They have no weapons in their hands, but the tips of their claws are shining with a metallic luster. According to the flame reaction experiments conducted on their remains, their claws contain calcium. In the form of radio waves, this information was transmitted from the analysis center of the command tower to every ship. Next, escalator-like conveyor belts rose from the decks of the ships. The wood golems that had been activated by the elemental shamans at the bottom of the warehouse stepped on the steps of the conveyor belt and were transported up one by one. They lined up neatly, walked to the side of the ship, and lightly jumped, and then landed on the sea surface. These wood golems were about the size of an ordinary person. Their appearance was a bit rough, as if they were pieced together with the leftovers of a furniture factory. But in fact, the material used to make the wood golems was dense and fine-grained wood, and in the process of making them, it was necessary to sprinkle a lot of rare alchemy powder and mashed herbs. The trade channels of the scale of perpetual order were wide enough, and many raw materials could be obtained at cost price. But to make a wood golem that could fight, it still cost about 30 disaster coins. And in the magic puppet shop in Sigil City, the usual retail price of a wood golem was more than 300 disaster coins. However, the price was dependent on the quality. These war machines that were carved from rare wood and then assembled into a seemingly rough human shape, and then hinged with 4 limbs could not only rely on their mutated legs to perfectly adapt to water combat, but they could also be used as a platform to carry many weapons on the water. Each wood golem had a thick right arm, which contained a small boiler used to drive the steam crossbow. Before they were made, they were implanted with the specialty of being proficient in aiming by spellcasters. There was almost no need to deliberately aim. These wood golems could easily find the movement trajectory of the swimming monsters, and then they would shoot an arrow, which had a high probability of hitting the enemy's head. And in the face of close combat, their arms, which were the same size as a normal person and held a cold iron sword, were like cheating. Under the joint action of the hinges, mortise and tenon structure, and the spherical joints, this arm could not only rotate more than 270 degrees, but it also had an amazing speed. Even if the enemy dodged the wood golem's shot, when facing it directly, they would still hit a curtain of swords. Chapter 844. You didn't expect them to do that, Stim said, his face ashen as he stared into the depths of the sea from the edge of an uninhabited cliff in the Dry Falls district. The god had already seen the rows of bi and pygmy monsters leaping into the dark waters from the edge of the cliff, before using their webbed feet to push against the water as hard as they could to cross clumps of gravel and rocks, over protruding rocks and seaweed growing on old ship hulls, and over the seawater filled with the smell of diesel near the sea urchin Spike's wharf as they swam into the distance and were slaughtered. "Those aren't scales but some kind of hard scab," the Emperor replied calmly. He had just realized that the god of virtual games had restored his ability to speak. Now, he used the calm tone that he often used when he was still a researcher in Demonfall and replied concisely, "I'm referring to the creations that you call Bayan gnomes. They are covered with a layer of scale-like armor. Naturally, to create a new species, even with the participation of the gods, it would take at least hundreds of years for it to be finalized. And the entire race of Bayan pygmies that I modified had only lived for 2 hourglasses. They are weak in every aspect, and that's actually very normal." Stim glared at him, but the Emperor continued to speak with fervor, with no intention of stopping to explain. "It's just that the surviving Bayan pygmies are undergoing irreversible evolution. It's so weak that you might not have noticed it. But evolution is evolution. As long as there's enough population size and enough external pressure, evolution will eventually manifest itself as external changes, and life will always find a way out for itself." To be honest, the Emperor's words were not false. The Bayan pygmies that were fighting against the wood golems were indeed evolving at an astonishing rate. Some of the injured Bayan pygmies that were lucky enough to survive would feed on the corpses of their companions. As they replenished their energy, their wounds would gradually heal, and the weak factors that allowed them to survive would also be magnified to varying degrees. In fact, the evolution had already begun after they were attacked by the depth charges. The Bayan pygmies that survived the shockwave all developed hard scabs on their skin to weaken the impact of the explosion. But that was just a common evolution. What was even more unbelievable was that the Bayan pygmies themselves were evolving differently as they fought against the wood golems. The Bayan pygmies that relied on emergency braking or sudden swerving to avoid being shot by the wood golem steam crossbows had their fins growing in size. The Bayan pygmies that were injured in exchange for avoiding a headshot either had their brains gradually spread to other parts of their body, or their hard scabs turned into real armor. The reason for this phenomenon is because their souls haven't fully adapted to their bodies, and the soul cocoons that I've bestowed upon them. But the Bayan pygmies and pygmies is in pygmy and pygmies, and Bayan pygmies ss pygmies ss est. Or perhaps, before all the evolutions to facilitate combat were finalized, these pitiful fellows would all fall at the hands of those wood demon statues. Chapter 845. Other than the basic function of killing, some of the ice elementals summoned by the elemental cannonballs also had the important mission of collecting samples. They would not directly eradicate the gnomes by strangling them. Instead, they would turn into an ice coffin and encase them within their bodies. Every time such a mission was completed, these ice elementals would quickly move towards the flagship of King's Landing City, the Eastern Mighty Might. They would be salvaged by the sailors on the deck and then transported to the bottom floor of the bridge control tower. There, Snyder had temporarily built a cabin for himself as a special laboratory during wartime. Of course, this laboratory was for public use. The great engineer Shay and the ogre shaman Paru would also appear here to assist the Demolik in his research. In other words, the gnomes that were sent here to be experimented on were unfortunately subjected to 3 different types of torture. From a certain point of view, compared to their kind that were directly killed, their fate was even more tragic. However, since they were no longer natural creatures, but monsters that had almost lost their self-awareness, moral standards no longer applied to them. The first to experiment was always Paru. Actions speak louder than words was the nature of the ogres. Snade used magic to help him control the ice elementals to thaw them. This way, the ogre shaman could skip the step of cutting open the ice coffin. He first grabbed the 6 gnomes and fixed them on 6 stainless steel dissection tables. To prevent the samples from struggling, Sneyd and Shay used magic and anesthetic gas to make the three monsters fall into a deeper sleep. Next, accompanied by the buzzing sound of an electric wheel saw, Paru began his work. Due to his talent in biological dissection, even though he had only read some illustrations of the gnome's body structure, through observation, they had already guessed that these new monsters might have originally been gnomes. Palu's technique was still very mature when it came to dissecting the gnomes. Not only did he not break any of the sample's bones, but he also dissected the muscles, organs, nerves, and bones of the gnomes and kept the samples alive. Even with Shay's life support equipment and the help of the Demolika's magic, it was not easy to achieve this. This required the dissection speed and the dexterity of the fingers of the surgeon to be extremely high. Even Sneyd, the legendary archmage of the school of necromancy who often conducted vivisection experiments, had to admit that he was not confident that he could ensure the survival of the experimental subjects after the first dissection of a brand new species, let alone the survival of all 6 experimental subjects. These new monsters are the same as the ones I've dissected before. They all have the characteristics of Ramsey creatures. They're not interplanar creatures. After completing the autopsy, Paru poured the blood, muscle tissue, and small pieces of nerves from each corpse into a small golden cauldron and quickly boiled it into a paste using a gas lamp. Then, he used many straws to drip them into the glass bottles containing different voodoo potions for testing. The potions in the glass bottles still maintained their original color, which meant that the monster created by the Emperor was not a magical creature or a creature from another plane. Incredible! Shay, the wondrous craftsman, could not help but sigh. If the Emperor had created a creature from another plane or a magical creature that could adapt to the climate, microbes, and other environments of this plane, it wouldn't have been difficult. But instead, he created a mediocre, native creature. This is not a skill that mortals should have. Generally speaking, apart from natural evolution, the only existence that can create such a creature can only be a god. If a layman were to hear Shay's words, they might be confused. However, because the other 2 subjects were true experts in their respective fields, they also had a deep understanding of Shay's word. Creating a creature was not rare. Among the various magical creatures and interplanar creatures in the multiverse, and even the elemental creatures without flesh and blood, many were the experimental products of powerful mages. But so far, apart from the Emperor who could create monsters in batches, there should not be any mortals who had successfully created a native creature that could perfectly adapt to a material plane. Apart from nature itself, only certain gods could accomplish such a feat of creation. And generally speaking, they had to be extremely powerful gods, because they could create intelligent creatures that could adapt to the material plane. They could naturally and easily become the gods of those creatures. As long as those creatures multiplied enough, they could easily become a great god. And this is only in the Ramsey plane. If he really has the ability to create new races of monsters in a similar way in other planes, then it would be a piece of cake for the Emperor to become a powerful god. Sneyd also commented. But it is precisely for this reason that since the scales of eternal order have become enemies with him, then we have to completely eliminate this hidden danger. After a rational analysis, although the 3 experts had different starting points, Paru and Sneyd purely considered that instead of leaving a powerful enemy for the scales of eternal order and keys, it was better to nip the hidden danger in the bud as soon as possible. Shay had previously discovered that the Emperor's technique of creating monsters seemed to have applied some of the chaotic characteristics of the illusionary snake race. Out of the eternal will of resistance left from ancient times, he had to oppose the rise of the Emperor. But they still reached a consensus. After completing the dissection and confirming the characteristics of the monster, the following work was mainly led by Sneyd. The steampunk Demolika began to cast spells. They had dissected many kinds of monsters before and found some mechanisms used by the Emperor to control them. Each of the Calamity Generals created by the Emperor was equivalent to a signal relay station for the Emperor. He had 10 Calamity Generals. In theory, he could use 10 different ways to control these monsters: pheromones, sound, light, electromagnetic waves, etc. But the Emperor was resurrected with the help of the Calamity Generals, and Sneyd and the others had not encountered any monsters under the control of the Calamity Generals. I'm inclined to think that this is a new behavior mechanism. After checking the organs of each experimental body with spells, Sneyd confirmed that these monsters were not controlled by spells and put forward his own speculation. Because there are no Calamity Generals under the Emperor's command, the monsters created so far may be like the golems. After the Emperor instills the basic knowledge and mission goals into them, the rest is completely dependent on their own judgment to deal with. But, without precise control, if the Emperor wants to complete his goal, won't it become a matter of probability? Only when enough intelligent creatures are transformed into monsters can the Emperor be closer to completing the mission, Shay asked. From the Emperor's point of view, the only reasonable solution is to transform as many dwarfs on Dwarf Island as possible into monsters. But, will Stim really agree with him? I mean, is that God the god of the dwarfs? Chapter 846. You really don't intend to do anything? Looking at the god of virtual games, Stim, who had his back to him, the Emperor asked nonchalantly. After all, 20,000 new petitioners in your divine realm may not be of good quality, but the welcome change in numbers would definitely compensate for the reluctance and sorrow in your heart. As the god of the dwarfs, even if his core divinity was virtual games, the divinity of dwarfs would still affect him in some way. Stripping away the lives of more than 20,000 dwarves, even if it wasn't killing the goose that laid the golden eggs, and even if the souls of those dwarves would obtain eternal life in the virtual server of their kingdom in the form of some special petitioners, Stim still felt a little sad. Tears had already seeped out of his clone's eyes, but were immediately wiped away by divine power. Now that you mention it, it really is. Stim, who had his back to the Emperor, grinned viciously. Divine power instantly appeared in his hand, and a thunderbolt that was created out of thin air was instantly transmitted to the Emperor through the chain. Additional special petitioners, increased divine power. Perhaps the quality isn't good enough, but the quantity is worth celebrating. Fortunately, Stim at least maintained his rationality, and didn't use all of the gratifying increase in power on the Emperor. Staring at the Wufu dwarfs that were almost slaughtered on the distant sea, the god raised his palm. He wanted to use divine power to bless those unclean monsters. He wanted to create a suitable battlefield for them. I advise you not to do so. Smoke came out of the Emperor's mouth, and because his vocal cords were burned by the thunderbolt, his voice was a little hoarse. Life will find a way out for itself. Only by going through enough training could they become stronger. Moreover, the spellcasters of King's Landing City have used elemental magic to complete the transformation of this region of the sea. Rather than wasting your energy to create an advantage for the Wufu dwarfs, you might as well look for the next Dry Falls district. The best way is to provide more samples for the evolution. Stim turned his head abruptly and glared at the Emperor. Affected by the god's emotions, the air seemed to have turned into steel, and began to squeeze the Emperor from all directions, as if to grind him into a pile of meat paste. You even promised that converting the residents of the Dry Waterfall district would be enough to resist the fleet of the scale of perpetual order. If all the residents of Steam City are converted, who will control the defense equipment? He, the Emperor suddenly burst into laughter. Coupled with his hoarse voice, he sounded like a jackal. He used his laughter to disperse the air that was squeezing him, and his entire person seemed to have changed from his previous submissive appearance. Error. It's just an error. Ha ha ha, since you've already asked, you must have already predicted the worst-case scenario in your mind. or rather, the upper limit of what can be accepted. The heart of the god of virtual games, stimuli, felt a chill. He suddenly realized that he had become a gambler sitting in front of a gambling table, unable to turn back after his first bet. Unless he could win this bet, there was no need for him to take the risk. This time, although he realized that he had been deceived, he did not waste his divine power to punish the emperor who had deceived him. He pressed his palm down. "The Dome District," Stimuli said coldly after casting the spell. "The residents there have all fallen into a deep slumber. The population is more than 150,000. They are all craftsmen or business families that have business ties with the Ramsey continent. Many of them have profited from the exchange of crystal coins, and now it's their turn to repay Dwarf Island." "Think what you will," the Emperor replied, bowing his head. Then, his body slipped into the void, and the chain formed from divine power followed him to the center of the Dome District. The Emperor stood on top of a landmark called the Steam Dome. Gears and levers driven by steam were constantly moving around it, forming a complex clock structure. The dwarves who lived in this district could often tell the time by looking at the scale of the rotating roof when they opened their windows to look at the steam dome. On the hour, the chimney of the steam dome would emit white steam amidst a series of sirens. "Lucky gamblers will only leave when they lose everything," the Emperor thought to himself. Countless soul cocoons that looked like fireflies and shone with a faint green light surged out of his sleeves. They entered the buildings in the Dome District through the cracks in the doors and windows. They would find the dwarves who had been hypnotized by the gods and possess them. Not long after, the same thing that happened in the Dry Waterfall District was repeated in the Dome District. Souls were separated from the bodies of the dwarves and floated in the air. They stacked on top of each other, forming a dreamlike scene. Perhaps it was because there were too many souls gathered in this place, forming a large hazy fog. In the end, the fog and the souls were all sucked into Stimuli's divine artifact, completing the process of uploading a new life. "Those little monsters have been cleaned up," Blue the Ogre said to his brother, Nalu. The commander of the expedition launched by the scale of perpetual order from King's Landing City was this brawny ogre. Even though the size of the three ogre brothers was taken into consideration, the bridge command room of the Eastern Might was designed to be spacious enough. However, Nalu still had to use the transformation bracelet that Snade had specially made for him to shrink his body to the size of his brother. Only then could he stay in the bridge. The reason why Keyes gave him the command of this expedition was mainly because of his title, Weapon Master. The scale of perpetual order had already dabbled in the field of weapon creation. In this war, he would be able to test those weapons in actual combat. The best candidate to lead this experiment was undoubtedly Nalu the Ogre, who was an avid combat enthusiast and was familiar with the characteristics of various weapons. Order the fleet to prepare to launch the ballistic missiles and the landing ships to charge. Inform the Nephrimendis to prepare to airdrop the signal coordinates to Steam City. Everyone, get ready. Nalu turned his head from the spiritual spell visual projection on the bridge and loudly ordered a team of kobold messengers from the Dragon Clan who were standing upright, including those secret attack weapons, throw them all into this siege and landing battle. We don't want to use those tactics to add fuel to the fire. Since we are going to fire the first shot, let's make it loud and clear. Chapter 847. Missile launchers rose from the steel ships, and all the missiles were aimed at the direction of the Steam City. The first missile shot out with a long flaming tail and hit the breakwater of the port of the Steam City. Hundreds of missiles followed soon after. On average, they were hit by a missile every 10 yards or so. The energy in the alchemy potion suddenly burst out and blew the solid concrete into pieces. When the missiles rose into the air, 7 or 8 landing ships with strange bows suddenly separated from the fleet. When they reached the edge of the range of the Steam City's coast defense cannons, their bows suddenly tilted forward, revealing the cabins of the 3 decks. The magic lines in the cabin immediately lit up, and the hovercraft, which was already full of warriors, flew out of the cabin like a sharp arrow. They spread out in the shape of a fan with jagged edges. It was as if a murderer had opened its mouth full of sharp teeth and lunged at the port where the shell of the steam city had been knocked off. Each hovercraft was manned by an elemental shaman. With the help of the magic array branded on the bottom of the ship, they could summon dozens of strong air elementals at once. These elementals carried the hull of the ship and made it float above the sea. With this design, the ships could ignore the terrain to a certain extent even if they were on land. In addition to the elemental shamans, each hovercraft also carried 30 fully armed polar bearmen or camel warriors. These powerful warriors were wearing the latest model of fanatic armor and holding electric assault rifles that could shoot spike. The muzzles were also equipped with axe-shaped bayonets suitable for close combat. Under the protection of the external armor, as long as the hovercraft was not hit by the coast defense cannons, they would not be in any danger during the landing process. Once they set foot on Dwarf Island, the danger to the enemy would come from this group of strong warriors who were full of fighting spirit. To coordinate with the landing of the hovercraft, the airships hovering in the sky made the corresponding arrangements. The doors of the Leviathan airships opened, and the winged Eddard kobolds jumped out in rows, each carrying an aerial bomb. They swooped down to the coast defense cannons, then pulled the fuses and let the big guns in their hands fall from the sky. There was no prelude. The continuous rumbling of explosions immediately played the strongest movement of this landing battle. The entire steam city was shaken by the explosion. Many of the pygmy guards in the city had to take some courage potions to be able to guard their posts with peace of mind. After the coastal defense cannons were destroyed, the steam-powered tanks became the second target of Eddie's aerial forces. Due to the severity of the damage, the dwarf commander had no choice but to cancel the order for the tanks to assemble. He could only order the mechanical chocobo riders to use the streets as cover to approach the hovercraft that had already washed ashore. Ignore the vehicles, prioritize the living targets. In the public channel of the mechanical chocobo riders, the commander gave his orders. After that, he could only hope that this weapon, which had been invented hundreds of years ago and optimized by generations of gnome craftsmen, would be able to reverse the disadvantageous situation he was in. However, when the confident mechanical chocobo riders locked on to their targets and pulled the trigger, they were shocked to find that the once invincible machine guns were useless in front of the mad armor. After being upgraded dozens of times by Snade, the current fanatic armor was not only an exoskeleton system that could increase the wearer's strength and agility with the help of the biomass muscles, but it was also a true armor. The outer tempered ceramic modular plate armor was not only cheap to build and had a reasonable weight, but it was also as sturdy as Bartholomew's iron. Not to mention, when every piece of modular plate armor was put together, it formed two sets of special protection with completely different mechanisms. One layer was a magical protection, mainly to protect the wearer from curses and enchantment spells. The other layer was a damping force field, designed by Shea and implemented with the technology of the wondrous craftsman. It was used to withstand the attacks of metal kinetic weapons. What the hell? Bullets can't even penetrate their armor. In an instant, a mixture of exclamations and curses filled the public channel of the mechanical chocobo riders. They found that only 2 or 3 bullets hitting the same spot could penetrate the force field around the zealot armor of the polar bear warriors or camel warriors. The force field would automatically reflect the attack once the bullets hit the same spot. But even if the force field was broken, the bullets with little kinetic energy would only be able to scratch the paint coating when they hit the hard modular armor. What was even more terrifying was that after seeing the strongest shield, the mad warriors also showed the mechanical chocobo riders what the strongest spear was. They pulled the triggers of the electric rifles in their hands, and the high-energy batteries released electricity to create an electric field that propelled the metal spikes out of the gun barrels. Due to their size, even without the mad armor, the polar bear men and camel warriors were like small giants in front of the gnome mechanical chocobo riders. The electric assault rifles in the hands of the mad warriors were no different from electric assault cannons to the mechanical chocobo riders. As long as one of the spikes hit the mechanical chocobo, the gnome's strongest land vehicle would be destroyed in an instant. The lucky riders would be ejected out of the cockpit in time, and to conserve ammunition, the mad warriors would usually not fire back at them. The unlucky riders, on the other hand, would end up in the same state as the mechanical chocobo that was smashed into pieces by the spikes, and subsequently exploded. If the enemy soldiers all wear such armor and hold such powerful weapons, then there's no need to fight this battle. Seeing the invincibility of the mad warriors on the battlefield, whether it was the gnome mechanical chocobo riders on the front lines, or the commanders in the rear, they all had the same thought in their minds. Of course, they were worrying too much. The latest generation of mad warrior armor and electric assault rifles were not cheap goods. Even with the wealth of the scale of perpetual order, they could not afford to equip all their soldiers with such equipment. Only over 200 of the polar bear men and camel warriors who had been selected with the best skills and tactics were qualified to be the mad warriors this time. Their mission was to charge head-on, intimidate the enemy on the battlefield, and be responsible for attracting the enemy's attention. And the reason why they did this was naturally to coordinate with the other forces. The number of aerial bombs dropped by the Eddard Kobold Air Force was so large that many of them did not explode after landing. The gnomes thought that they were some duds, but in reality, after landing, the bombs would release a large amount of alchemical solvent that emitted a strange smell. They were actually a special kind of pudding. These mud-shaped creatures were specially coated by magic, and after coming into contact with the ground, they would spread outwards according to a certain pattern. As they spread, they would corrode the ground and leave marks on it. Within a dozen breaths, these marks would connect into one. At the same time, the pudding would instantly ignite under the effect of the spell, activating these seemingly disorderly marks that were actually spell runes. The beacon has been established, the teleportation circle has been completed. The Leviathan airship, Nephremon Dis, hovering high in the sky, sent a signal to the eastern mighty might. Chapter 848. Magic flames rose, and 35 teleportation portals suddenly opened. Due to the limited materials, they could only last for about half an hourglass. However, this didn't hinder the enthusiasm of the soldiers who had unsheathed their swords and loaded their weapons. Attention, everyone! Follow your captain closely. Because of the rune disc tied to his hand, only he knows the direction of your attack. Next, everyone! Line up and charge. In front of the portal on each steel ship, the pre-war mobilization order from the bridge sounded from the loudspeakers. The boorish voice of the ogre reached the ears of every warrior who was ready to attack without any hindrance. This mobilization was only to reiterate some precautions and didn't boost morale at all. In his opinion, with the power of this elite army, it was only a matter of time before they won the battle of the city. If they couldn't defeat the gnomes in Steam City, that would be the biggest joke in the world. With nervous steps, groups of polar bear men and hunchback warriors swarmed out of the teleportation portal. They were organized in standard 10-man squads. Every 10 squads formed a 100-man squad, which was led by a centurion. Several elemental shamans formed a magic unit and followed the centurions as advisors. Within half an hourglass of the opening of each portal, 10 100-man squads would pass through the portal. All the centurions were in contact with their division commanders through a magic communication device. For the sake of tactical security, although the division commanders were also in these 10 100-man teams, and they were equipped with the rapid gearing fanatic armor, which was even more advanced than the landing commandos, they wore the same uniforms as ordinary soldiers. Other than the division commander's personal guards and the 10 centurions, no one could recognize the highest commander of the division. However, there were always exceptions. For Wulfgar's honor. For the Thunder Bear. The polar bearmen soldiers who walked out of the 33rd portal all shouted this slogan because their division commander was the famous Thunder Bear, the son of the polar bearmen's chief, Wulfgar. Moreover, no matter how hard he tried to hide Wulfgar's body size, which was at least 1/3 larger than an ordinary polar bearman, and his thunderous voice couldn't be hidden at all. Thus, Wulfgar didn't plan on hiding himself. After passing through the portal, he immediately put on his fanatic armor. The black and white ceramic armor modules were quickly put on. Wulfgar appointed himself as the vanguard of the army. After locking onto the target on the runic disc, he immediately gave the order, light and heavy weapons, charge straight at the target. After saying that, Wulfgar took the lead and rushed out. There was a wall not far in front of him. He didn't even raise his arm to protect his helmet. He directly smashed a big hole in the brick wall. Behind him, the polar bear warriors roared and quickly followed. Like an erupting mountain torrent, they pierced through all the obstacles in front of them. Like melted candles, all the dwarves living in the Dome district stood upright on the ground. Their hair fell all over the ground and their facial features drooped, not as lively as before. This was because after being parasitized by the Emperor's soul cocoon, their souls had all been expelled from their bodies. The weak soul worms that occupied their bodies could only evolve into designed monsters and couldn't take on any other redundant responsibilities. They've become instant beasts, the Emperor explained to Stim, who appeared behind him out of nowhere, while looking at his creations with satisfaction. It means that they can explode with powerful destructive power in an extremely short period of time. All their power comes from their future selves. Dwarves can usually live for more than 300 years. If all their future life force is gathered in the next half an hourglass, even if the loss is as high as 99%, they can produce a group of unbelievably powerful berserkers. Reality proved that the Emperor indeed understood his monsters very well. Using the word berserker to describe the transformed instant beasts was simply the most appropriate. Although they were motionless like candles at first, when they felt the slightest vibration, they would instantly go berserk. Steam would come out of their nostrils and ears, and the knotted muscles under their darkened skin would constantly twitch. Is this a dwarf that uses giant transformation? While charging forward, Wulfgar was forcefully pushed back by an animal that was about the same size as him. He looked at the large humanoid creature that appeared in front of him with some surprise. At this time, the Thunder Bear still hadn't realized that this was actually a monster. He only thought that the opponent might be a dwarf spellcaster that used giant transformation on him from the head that was disproportionately large to the body. Wulfgar raised the battle axe with his left hand. As he pressed the switch, the chainsaw attached to the blade of the axe began to hum and spin rapidly under the drive of the motor. The instant beast in front of him let out a roar and pounced at him with open arms. The war chief's son's face that was wrapped in the helmet of the berserker armor revealed a ferocious smile. He raised his right hand that was holding the electromagnetic assault rifle. Bang! 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 No one said that guns couldn't be used in close combat. Moreover, Wulfgar didn't want the enemy to hinder his attack. The sharp nails shot out 3 times in a row, all of which hit the instant beast's broad body and sent the monster flying in an instant. As its life faded away, the instant beast was like a punctured balloon and quickly turned back into a normal-sized dwarf. As expected, however, before Wulfgar could continue to charge forward, a few instant beasts that heard the commotion broke through the surrounding walls and once again surrounded the polar bearman. So many dwarf spellcasters? No, since they can cast spells, why would they use giant transformation to rush up and fight hand-to-hand? So, this should be a new kind of monster. Wulfgar, who had just reacted, could only raise his chainsaw battle axe to kill an instant beast that pounced on him while using the electromagnetic assault rifle to shoot at the monsters. Because he was powerful and was wearing the berserker armor, even if he was besieged by the instant beasts, Wulfgar still didn't fall into a disadvantage. However, the other polar bear men and camel warriors weren't so lucky. Faced with enemies that were similar in size and strength, but shockingly large in number, the king and Stim had turned all the residents of the dome area into instant beasts. Even if the failure rate was terrifyingly high, they still managed to create tens of thousands of instant beasts in one go. The polar bear men and camel warriors that were only equipped with the low-spec berserker armor and firearms instantly fell into a bitter battle. Calling for backup from the tower. Calling for backup from the tower. A new type of monster has been discovered. Currently, its characteristics are: with the high mobility granted by the berserker armor, Wulfgar attacked left and right, trying his best to reduce the pressure on his own soldiers. However, the situation of increasing casualties was still unavoidable. He could only ask for backup from the fleet's command center. Many of the commanders were doing the same thing as him. Chapter 849. Neferman Dis, the radio carried the message sent from the bridge of the eastern Xiongwei and transmitted to a giant airship at the top of the sky. There were no aviation troops on this airship because he was a Leviathan himself. I already know what you want to say. Now, do you authorize me to carry out the punishment operation? Just give me the word. Authorization approved, Neru said in a deep voice. Then, the ogre walked out of the command room and came to the deck of the eastern Xiongwei. All of his storm, exoskeleton equipment had been repaired by hundreds of mechanics. The steam ejector equipment had been compressed and loaded. On the spacious deck, the ogre was able to restore his huge body. First, he stepped his huge feet into the two mechanical boots of the mech. Then, under the effect of the spell, the remaining mech modules spread out on the deck quickly completed the automatic assembly and attached to Nalu's body. With a thunderous rumble, the storm mech was instantly pushed out of the deck of the eastern Xiongwei by a chain driven by high-pressure steam. In midair, the storm mech's body lit up with a bright anti-gravity rune array. Then, Neru controlled the two metal arms of the weapon and swung them backward. Two spheres suddenly appeared at the tips of the three mechanical claws. Like a falcon swooping down from the sky to hunt, the storm mech crossed the sea in an instant and fell from the sky into the area of the steam city where a new type of monster was reported. When it landed, more than a dozen cannon barrels appeared on the body of the mech in an instant. They aimed in all directions and launched a carpet bombing. A large number of instantaneous beasts that had gathered around Neru because of the vibration were all killed by the rain of cannonballs. However, this was only the first show of the storm mech. The reason why Neru the ogre wanted to drive this war weapon into the battle was actually to restrict the actions of some of his subordinates. After obtaining the authorization order, the Neferman Dis, which was hovering in the sky, immediately sent out a special frequency of electromagnetic waves to the surroundings. The 13 special Leviathan airships that received the command immediately began to shut down all their power engines, discharged the light gas in each airbag, and began to fall rapidly to the ground. These airships were the same as the Neferman Dis. They did not carry any aviation personnel. They were Leviathan war beasts disguised as city airships. Before using them, the reason why Neferman Dis needed to ask Commander Neru for authorization was that their original form before Leviathan was some enormous, indestructible, invincible behemoth. The behemoth was a powerful magical creature that was shaped by primordial energy and infused with elemental power. Although they resembled living creatures, they did not have fragile flesh. Almost all of the naturalists in the multiverse had a consensus that the behemoth was not a natural creature, but a creature specially created by the gods. The purpose of its existence was to punish mortals. This was because ever since mortals began to worship the gods had already understood how complicated the souls of mortals were. Sometimes, even the gods would wonder why these ordinary creatures hid so many evil natures. It was because of the large number of mortal souls falling into the abyss that caused the rise of the demons of Tana, Re, and the decline of the demons of Obylis. In some countries, when the sins of mortals were so severe that even the gods could not bear it, the gods would send plagues, floods, and their most terrible servants as punishment. Among these vengeful servants, the behemoth was the most frightening. A god or several gods united to create the behemoth from the primordial source of chaos, put it in a similar body, and filled its consciousness with axiom, justice, and an endless desire to destroy everything in its path. Then, these giant beasts would be allowed to slaughter their victims without restraint. Some of the kinder gods would take back the behemoth after calming down their anger. Some of the worse ones would ignore the suffering of mortals. They would let the behemoth unleash its endless desire to kill until the sinful countries were left with lifeless ashes, and even the entire world was destroyed by these living retributions. These broken continents might not have any life left, except for the behemoth that conquered them, as an immortal monument to the slaughtered worlds. Through the intelligence network in the sigil, the scale of perpetual order found some of these immortal monuments, but they had all been forgotten by their creators. Even the gods who created them had died. The Chamber of Commerce spent a lot of resources and sent a large number of adventurers to find the sleeping behemoths in those lifeless and ruined plains. Then, those people carefully collected some specimens from various sleeping behemoths and sent them back to the headquarters for analysis. In the end, the scale of perpetual order chose the most suitable 13 behemoths and implanted the flesh of Leviathan into them. Once the ruined planes were transformed into Leviathan airships, they would automatically transform into Leviathan airships and enter the giant interplanar portals that the Chamber of Commerce had specially constructed for them. This time, the scale of perpetual order went all out to attack Dwarf Island Steam City because they had to face a god. The 13 Leviathan behemoths also disguised themselves as airships and moved together with the expeditionary army. When a large number of powerful new monsters, instant beasts, appeared and the expeditionary army's attack was blocked, the behemoths were awakened by the announcement of the Nephremendis and were ready to carry out an operation called Punishment. The 13 Leviathan airships fell to the ground and turned back into Thunder Behemoth. Compared to the Storm Behemoths, Deep-Sea Behemoths, and some other behemoth subspecies, and even Terra and Taraski, the Thunder Behemoths were easier to control, so the Leviathan Behemoths transformed by the scale of perpetual order used them as the prototype. These huge beasts had 4 legs, and their forelimbs were longer than their hind limbs, and were much thicker. Their bodies were covered in heavy rock-like armor, and there were clusters of sharp horns on their heads. On their triangular heads, there was a pair of small eyes that did not match their body size, and they were always shining with a dark green light. The armor of the behemoths could reflect most magic attacks, and their bodies had a super-strong regenerative ability. Unless one continuously used wishing spells to attack their weak points, these thunder behemoths were almost impossible to kill by conventional means. In the battle sequence of the scale of perpetual order, only a few strong people like Nephremendis and Neru could temporarily subdue this group of war behemoths, and only keys could make them feel fear from head to toe. Therefore, before throwing them into the battlefield, Neru had prepared in advance. Do not attack indiscriminately, pay attention to distinguish between friend and foe. Those new monsters are your priority targets. With the help of the radio equipment on the mech, the brawny ogre sent his order in the form of electromagnetic waves and transmitted it to the minds of every thunder behemoth. Chapter 850. The thunder behemoths walked on the ground like the embodiment of a walking appetite. Driven by the hunger to devour everything, they ate all the animals, plants, and even buildings they encountered. In order to fill their 5 bottomless stomachs, they would gorge themselves in the jungles and forests, look for minerals in collapsed mines and mountains, and look for hidden delicacies in raised fortresses. They basically ate everything, and their appetites were amazing. And this was the reason why Nera had to restrain them personally. Otherwise, when these thunder behemoths went berserk, not to mention the enemies in Steam City, even the expeditionary army in King's Landing City would become their prey. That would be completely unnecessary damage. As the commander of the expeditionary army, Nehru could not sit back and watch that happen. Roar. After receiving the radio wave message, these giant beasts subconsciously roared to express their dissatisfaction. With their roars, the ground began to tremble involuntarily. The instant beasts that gathered close all suffered the effect of a spell similar to greater roar. The more resilient monsters shook their dizzy heads and continued to move forward. Those that did not pass the immunity test were all stunned in place because they were in a state of shock. Fortunately, I'm prepared. Nehru raised his arm helplessly. A capsule-shaped glass container appeared in the claw of the storm mech. He threw it to the ground. With a crack, the glass capsule suddenly shattered, and a light blue smoke rose from the ground. This was a magic weapon that Keyes gave him before he left to restrain the thunder behemoth. It contained a reagent made from the scales of the young blue dragon. Once released, the thunder behemoths could quickly smell Keyes' scent. The effect was very obvious. When the giant beasts that were about to riot felt the scent of the existence of the upper level of the food chain that they had experienced not long ago and was relatively fresh compared to their long lives, the thunder behemoths instantly stood up. As if their temperament had changed, they began to faithfully carry out the mission issued by Nehru and began a series of fierce attacks against the instant beasts. The thunder behemoths weaved through the dome of Steam City, plowing a path made of rubble and debris. A large number of buildings and rocks fell into their bottomless stomach. As long as an instant beast sounded and attacked, the thunder behemoths would spit out a barrage of rock fragments if they were far away. If they were near, these giant behemoths would directly swallow the monsters into their stomachs without any hesitation. Even the Emperor, who turned the dwarf residents of the dome area into instant beasts, was surprised by the efficiency of the thunder behemoths. "Either you deal with these behemoths or you provide me with more troops," the Emperor said bluntly to the god of virtual games beside him. The King's Landing City and the scale of perpetual order have too much resources and manpower. You have to do your best if you want to win against them. Stim instinctively wanted to reject the Emperor's suggestion as he felt the increase in divine power brought to him by those special petitioners. He wanted to use that divine power to deal with the crisis before him. But just as the god was about to act, he suddenly felt a chill in his heart, as if something threatened the very foundation of his existence. So he answered decisively, "I'll leave the Steam City to you. If you waste the lives of millions of dwarves, when I return, it will be the time for you to grind your bones to dust." With that, the clone of the god of virtual games abruptly vanished, leaving a metallic furnace glowing with green light where it stood. The Emperor looked at the divine artifact, his mind spinning rapidly. The divine chains on his body had already been removed by Stim. But it was precisely because of that he suddenly felt that something was wrong. He must have run into some serious trouble. Could the scale of perpetual order have launched a surprise attack on his divine kingdom apart from the expeditionary forces in the material plane? The Emperor pondered. Weighing the pros and cons, the Emperor was prepared to stay for one last fight even though he had thousands of doubts in his heart. After experiencing that crushing defeat 12 years ago, he had already lost all of his family's asset. If he still wanted to use the Ramsey plane as a bridgehead to enter the Leo clock tower in the mechanical realm, then the Steam City's counterattack would be his last chance to make a comeback. "I have to take the risk this time," the Emperor made up his mind. A large part of this was based on his speculation that Keyes might be looking for trouble with Stim's divine kingdom. As long as the terrifying Megalosaurus did not appear, even if he saw the might of the Jungleberg's expeditionary forces, he knew that this battle would be a fierce one. But he still felt that he had a chance. Taking a deep breath, the robe wrapped around the Emperor loosened. Then, as the myriad soul cocoons gushed out of his body, the hooded robe on his body instantly shattered into pieces, revealing his body that had been resurrected by tribulation's soul-searching corpse. His skin was a sickly grayish-brown, and when his robe shattered, he returned to his strange giant form. He had sharp antlers and jagged fangs. At the end of his inverted legs, a pair of black hooves floated a few feet above the ground. The Emperor shrugged his bear-like nose, calculated the time when the thousands of soul cocoons would break, and then went straight to the divine artifact left by Stim. He reached out and opened the lid of the furnace. Similar to before, a large number of souls from all over the steam city instantly converged into the divine artifact. However, the number of souls absorbed this time was too many. The souls of more than 1,000,000 dwarves were reborn at the same time. Even with the help of the divine artifact, it still took a lot of time. His large-scale transformation of the dwarves into monsters naturally attracted the attention of the Jungleberg's expeditionary forces. Ever since those souls were reborn, the missile silos on the Steel Fleet had not stopped. The precision missiles guided by magic crossed the short distance between them and fell on the Emperor's head like a torrential downpour. In order to ensure the smooth implementation of the plan, the Emperor had to carry the soul furnace and quickly move through the streets of the Steam City. Because the divine artifact could not be disturbed by spatial magic during the process of rebirth, the Emperor could not use teleportation. And because of the limited range of the divine artifact, he could not run out of the Steam City to avoid the missiles. After an entire hourglass, the Emperor panicked like a stray dog, constantly being crushed by the missiles falling from the sky. Several times, because the missiles fell too close, he could only use his body to block the damage for the soul furnace. Chapter 851. Enduring the pain on his skin and flesh, the Emperor opened his yellow eyes wide and recited loudly, "The day is the curtain, the night is the cover. We live in the bushes, hiding from the eyes of men. The power of darkness is like thorns and light. Sweep across the world the unseen light." As he spoke, the entire Steam City was shrouded in obscure magic waves. With nearly 1,000,000 gnomes as the materials, and with the help of the gods, the largest summoning ritual since the Emperor arrived in the Ramsey Plain 10,000 years ago was about to be completed. Even though it was impossible for all of the 1,000,000 gnomes to be fully transformed due to the survival rate, the number of monsters that could break out of their cocoons was already a terrifying number. It didn't take long for a large number of gnomes, instant beasts, reef-clawed monsters, drooping horse-headed monsters, 10-armed octopuses, gnome monsters, crow men. A large number of monsters, both on and off the scale of perpetual order, all poured into the streets of the Steam City. Because the Emperor had made some adjustments during the transformation, they were a little different from before. All the monsters secreted a large amount of black sticky liquid, like mud and caramel. If one were to observe closely, they would be able to see that the black liquid was emitting faint bubbles rhythmically and wriggling as if it were alive in the first place. At first, there were not too many monsters on the streets, so the effect of this strange liquid was not obvious. But as the transformation gradually completed, a large number of monsters flooded the street. The monsters that filled the streets and alleys began to rub shoulders with each other. The mucus that looked like living asphalt began to show its effect. It was an important medium that connected all the monsters one by one. At this time, the faint crackling sound became louder and louder, like firecrackers being set off. The black glue was like glue, sticking all the monsters into a ball, allowing them to remodel in a strange way. For example, a huge instant beast might have several 10-armed octopuses bearing their fangs and brandishing their claws on its head. One of its hands might become a reef-clawed monster that looked like a combination of eels and lobsters, while the other hand turned into 5 or 6 drooping horse-headed monsters that wriggled like snakes. On the soles of its feet, there might be a circle of gnomes with their mouths wide open. On the front and back of its chest, there might be a large group of gnomes squeaking. Another example would be similar monsters piling up like Lego bricks to create an even bigger monster. It was as if they were merging their own kind. Muscles and muscles, bones and bones, shells and shells, claws and fangs were constantly being added and expanded. Sweeping across the 8 barren lands, the unseen light. Ah! Admiring his masterpiece, the Emperor could not help but burst into laughter. He waved a hand through the air, and crimson light began to appear in the eyes of all of the befuddled creatures. Not only had they merged into one in form, but their minds and abilities had also merged into one. Their heads all turned towards the direction of the Lord's Landing Expeditionary Army that had landed in the Steam City. Don't leave a single enemy behind. Assimilate their flesh and blood into your bodies, and turn them into the power we need to conquer the Ramsey Plain. The Emperor shouted. His words instantly rang in the minds of every monster. Like falling dominoes, the pygmy buildings in the Steam City crumbled like paper as the integrated monsters charged in a straight line. They did not know how to be stingy with their power, even if they were injured. As long as they could touch other monsters again, the pygmy could assimilate them into their own bodies and repair all of their injuries at the same time. In the face of the onslaught of these monsters, the Lord's Landing Expeditionary Army was under great pressure. Not only from the ground but also from the air. A large number of 10-armed octopuses had fused with pygmy monsters and Bayan gnomes, turning into oversized beholders. They floated in the air and poured all kinds of spells on the Eddard kobolds and Leviathan airships that were acting as air carriers. Thunder behemoths, get into a tight formation and resist their charge head-on. Neru the ogre, who had personally come to the battlefield to command, immediately ordered. Steel Fleet dock. Use your cannons to wipe out the Steam City. All polar bear men and camel warriors who have not yet landed, get into position. You are about to fight a fierce battle. With the help of a magic communication device, Neru's words were first transmitted back to the bridge of the Eastern Mighty, and then to the commanders of the various troops. The expeditionary army became like a sophisticated machine. When the command was given, all the soldiers at their posts immediately carried out their task. They had already rehearsed the intensity of the battle long before they set off. As for the pygmy monsters that were wreaking havoc in the sky will always be the home of the Megalosaurus. Neferman Dis let out a roar that shook the sky, and then changed from the Leviathan airship to the form of an ancient brown dragon. The airship's airbag spewed out a large amount of gas and became dry. The 2 rows of thorns on its back stretched out, and the membrane between them was like a glider. Brown dragons did not have the traditional wings of the Megalosaurus, but this did not mean that they could not fly. In fact, with the weight of the Megalosaurus, they could only soar in the sky because of the power of magic. As an ancient brown dragon, Neferman Dis was also an overlord in the sky. He directly pounced on a pygmy monster that looked like a beholder. 2 thick front claws tore the monster's body apart. The 10-armed octopus attached to the huge monster kept shooting all kinds of magic rays at Neferman Dis, but when the rays hit the ceramic skin of the ancient Megalosaurus, they could not break through the defense at all. He took a deep breath and used scorching sand breath on the wound he tore. The scorching sand was sharper than a blade, and in an instant, the monster's body was corroded with thousands of holes. The scorching hot sand covered the pygmy monster, and the layer of strange black mud turned into a layer of hard scab and lost its vitality. The 100,000 octopuses that formed the pygmy monster were fine, at least they could still fly, but the remaining pygmies and pygmy monsters that were not torn apart by the scorching sand breath and thought that they had escaped the disaster were all in trouble. They fell from the sky to the ground. "It's you again, you reptile." Seeing Neferman Dis, The Emperor instantly recognized this megalosaurus that was the vanguard to attack his promontory stronghold 12 years ago. He raised his hand and used internal explosion, forcing Nefermindis to close his mouth tightly and endure the violent magic waves that erupted in his body. He rushed into the sky to digest the overbearing spell that could dig out his internal organs. Humph! The Emperor said disdainfully. He did not continue to kill Nefermindis. After all, there were many aerial troops and Leviathan airships in the sky. Now, taking advantage of the appearance of the pygmy monster, it was more cost-effective to inflict heavy damage to the landing forces of King's Landing City. But just as he was about to mobilize dozens of pygmy monsters to first resist the Thunder Behemoth's frontal charge, and then let the other pygmy monsters circle back to the landing forces and the Steel Fleet, a voice suddenly appeared behind him. Holy Persuasion! A paladin holding a forged steel horse-slaying sword with one hand and a shining palm pressed against the Emperor's back. Chapter 852. Jensen had arrived at the battlefield. To be honest, although this paladin was also one of the main members of the Scales of Eternal Order, his presence had never been strong. But this did not mean that Jensen was weak. After all, a saint samurai who was able to solo a demon lord, an existence who was favored by the power of virtue, and a talent who was treated as a national knight by Quess, could not be considered a weakling no matter what. Especially when he encountered true evil, when he encountered a sin that was completely contrary to his belief in virtue, and when he encountered the Emperor who had turned 1,000,000 gnomes into monsters. Jensen burst out with a strong fighting spirit in an instant. Relying on his martial arts skills, he silently appeared behind the enemy's back, just like the most brilliant wanderer. Then, without a word, he cast Divine Persuasion. The vast and majestic power of benevolence instantly responded to his summons, surging into the brand-new body that the Emperor had constructed with the remains of Calamity's soul, repeatedly cleansing the sins within. As one of the origins of the multiverse, the power of virtue was far from comparable to some other forces. It instantly destroyed the existence in the Emperor's body that was contrary to his belief. In other words, it disintegrated the Emperor's brand-new body in an instant. Like a frightened magic rabbit, the Emperor did not even have time to curse before his body turned into pieces of shining stardust and disappeared into the streets of Steam City. However, this did not mean that he was dead. After turning 1,000,000 gnomes into monsters, how could the Emperor not reap some benefits for himself? Because he was now reincarnated from Soul Search, he was essentially a kind of soul polymer. His previous body was just made up of soul fragments. After his body was annihilated by Jensen's Divine Persuasion, the Emperor decisively gave up resistance at the last moment and turned to other ways to avoid this disaster. Cannot be destroyed, all are one, all are one, all are one. From the body of a gnome monster on the street, the Emperor's soul had finished growing again. Half a block of monsters dripping with black mucus were now all lying on the ground. They used their fragile souls that had just grown to complete the nourishment for the Emperor, allowing him to revive once again. Seeing this scene, Jensen frowned. "Thou shalt atone for thy sins." The paladin stretched out 2 fingers, and a shining rune appeared beside the Emperor. The Emperor's body, which had just recovered, began to twitch unnaturally. He wanted to retreat and hide in the streets, but he couldn't help but slow down. At this time, Johnson came to him again. The paladin samurai raised his forged steel horse-slaying sword and unleashed a series of attacks that were infused with the power of Evil Destroyer. At the critical moment, even though he had covered himself with several layers of protection from kindness enchantments in time, he had still been struck by the saber many times. Pitch-black blood flowed out and dyed his dark gray fur red. Heavy strike, ultimate benevolence slash. Seeing that the Emperor was still resisting, and at the same time, this guy was unwilling to give up and summoned other monsters or integrated monsters in an attempt to get them to save him. Johnson's face instantly became solemn. He began to use a strengthened version of the evil-destroying slash, called ultimate benevolence slash. The belief of kindness in the multiverse was now endlessly providing support to Jensen. With the paladin samurai's body as the channel, the surging holy power instantly rushed out of his body. The surrounding environment was also affected by the holy power. The silver-white light was as thick as milk, shrouding the Emperor and Jensen. In this area, not only was there no room for any evil spells or teleportation spells, there was a 90% chance that they would be inexplicably interrupted, and every swing of Jensen's sword had an additional heavy strike effect. The Emperor was in great pain. More and more wounds appeared on his body. The monsters that wanted to support him, when approaching this area, were like candles in an open flame, melted and ignited. In this situation, the Emperor couldn't guarantee that if his body was destroyed by Jensen again, he could find a random monster to reincarnate and stand up again. Damn this guy! He was furious. Because he was in the place where the holy power of kindness accumulated, he couldn't curse out loud. Even if he cursed in his heart, it would only increase the power of the holy power's counterattack. When fighting back against Jensen, he couldn't use any evil spells. For his current body, which was supposed to be the best at using spiritual spells, there was no fairness at all. He could only give up on spiritual spells and selectively use some incantation spells. Most of the time, he used defensive spells on himself while using the most direct evocation spells to fight back against Jensen. Unfortunately, it was not an exaggeration to say that the legendary Saint Samurai was the natural enemy of evocation spells. Thanks to the legendary characteristic called Holy Immunity, most of the evocation spells that hit Jensen's body were like stones thrown into the sea, and only a few of them had some effect. Moreover, even if Jensen couldn't buy any high-value armor and weapons because he had to abide by the poverty oath, but as a founding member of the Scale of Perpetual Order, the equipment that was temporarily given to him were at least high-level enchanted treasures. Even the most inconspicuous forged steel horse-slaying sword was a divine weapon with the triple effects of edge, sturdy, and heavy strike. Needless to say, the plate armor on his body was also branded with the corresponding merit badge because he participated in killing the tyrant worm. Killing a demon overlord was a great honor recognized by the power of virtue. This plate armor was also blessed by the origin of the multiverse. If it wasn't for the fact that the creator wasn't a god, it would have been a precious artifact. But even so, with this seemingly ordinary plate armor, any spells cast by the Emperor were useless against Jensen. The Emperor was very angry. Compared to fighting, he was actually better at using spells to fight. But this skill that he used to be proud of could not be used at all now. He could only bite the bullet and fight against Jensen, who was holding a heavy sword while desperately summoning the monsters to rush into the holy power's encirclement no matter what to save himself. Multitasking wasn't a difficult task for an emperor, but when faced with a sacred samurai with strong beliefs and outstanding martial arts skills, doing so would be a path to death. Not long after, his body was covered with wounds of various sizes caused by the forged steel horse-slaying sword. And under the erosion of the holy power, these wounds could not be healed at all. Facing the heavy sword that was aimed at his face, the Emperor quickly put his hands together and blocked it more than a foot in front of him. Then, ignoring the cut on his palm, he tried his best to snatch the sword from Jensen's hands. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.